Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. Tonight we're going somewhere enormous. The Spanish Empire was not merely the largest empire of its age, it was the first empire in human history to circle the entire globe, planting its flag on every continent, binding together peoples who had never heard of each other, and reshaping the planet in ways so profound that we are still living inside its consequences right now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The Iberian Peninsula before Spain. The story of the Spanish Empire does not begin with Columbus or with Ferdinand and Isabella, or even with the wars of the Reconquista. It begins much earlier, in a land shaped by geography before it was ever shaped by politics. The Iberian Peninsula is a remarkable piece of the earth, hanging from the southwestern edge of Europe like an afterthought, separated from Africa by only a narrow strip of water at the Strait of Gibraltar, surrounded on three sides by the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. It is a place that has always attracted arrivals. Mountains cut across it in dramatic ridges, river valleys open into fertile plains, the interior plateau is dry and unforgiving in summer and bitterly cold in winter. The coasts are gentle and welcoming. This was not one landscape, but many, and that variety produced not one culture, but many, layered on top of one another across thousands of years. The earliest inhabitants we know much about were a collection of peoples archaeologists grouped together loosely under the name Iberians, though that label covers an enormous diversity of languages, customs, and ways of life. They lived along the eastern and southeastern coasts, farming, trading, and building towns with distinctive artistic traditions. Inland, a different group flourished, the Celts, who had migrated south from Central Europe and settled the western and central regions of the peninsula, mixing in places with the Iberians to produce a hybrid culture historians call Celtiberian. These were the peoples who built hilltop settlements, raised cattle, fought fiercely among themselves, and created a world that felt more Atlantic and continental than Mediterranean. Then the outsiders began to arrive, and the Iberian Peninsula entered its long career as a crossroads. The Phoenicians came first, or at least they were among the first whose traces survive clearly. By around 900 before the Common Era, these great maritime traders from the eastern Mediterranean had established ports along the southern coast of Iberia. Their most important settlement was called Gader, which the Romans would later rename Gades, and which today we know as Cadiz, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the Western world. The Phoenicians were not interested in conquest. They were interested in silver. The peninsula contained enormous mineral wealth, particularly in its southern regions, and the Phoenicians extracted and traded it with characteristic efficiency. They brought their alphabet, their gods, and their network of connections. They left behind traces in place names, in metalworking traditions, and in the slow seeping of Mediterranean culture into a peninsula that had previously been more removed from the great centres of civilization to the east. The Greeks followed, establishing their own trading colonies along the northeastern coast. Empres, known in Greek as Emporion, meaning simply the marketplace, was founded around 600 before the Common Era and became one of the most important Greek settlements in the western Mediterranean. The Greeks brought their pottery, their wine, their ideas about urban life, and their habit of writing things down. Neither the Phoenicians nor the Greeks attempted to conquer the interior. They were content with their coastal footholds, their access to trade routes, and their relationships with the local populations who supplied them with raw materials. Then came Carthage, and things became considerably more serious. The Carthaginians were descendants of Phoenician settlers in North Africa, who had built their own powerful civilization centered on the great city of Carthage near modern Tunis. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, Carthage was one of the dominant powers of the western Mediterranean, and its attention had turned decisively toward Iberia after the First Punic War against Rome ended badly for Carthage in 241. Before the Common Era, the general Hamilcar Barca arrived in Iberia with an army and a mission. He intended to use the peninsula's wealth, its silver and its manpower, to rebuild Carthaginian strength. His son-in-law Hasdrubal founded a new capital called Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, in 227 before the Common Era, and Hamilcar's famous son, a young man named Hannibal, grew up in Iberia watching his father build an empire. The Carthaginian presence in Iberia was something qualitatively different from what the Phoenicians and Greeks had done. This was conquest, organised and systematic. Local tribes were either subdued or drawn into alliance. Mines were worked at massive scale with large numbers of labourers, many of them slaves. The peninsula was being remade as a resource base for Carthaginian ambition, and that ambition eventually led Hannibal, following his famous crossing of the Alps with his elephants that everyone remembers from school, to nearly destroy Rome itself. Rome won that Second Punic War in 202 before the Common Era, and one of the consequences was that Iberia passed from Carthaginian into Roman hands. The Romans called the peninsula Hispania, which is where the name Spain ultimately comes from, and they would spend the next 2 centuries fighting to bring all of it under their control. The conquest of Hispania was neither quick nor easy. The Celtiberian tribes of the interior fought with remarkable tenacity. The city of Numantia in the northern Meseta held out against Roman siege for so long and so stubbornly that when it finally fell in 133 before the Common Era, the Romans felt they had achieved something genuinely exceptional. Numantia became a byword for heroic resistance in later Spanish culture, invoked centuries later as a symbol of the Spanish character. Whether or not that makes cultural sense across 2,000 years, the Romans clearly found the Iberians a serious military problem. But Roman control, once established, transformed the peninsula profoundly. Roads were built, connecting every corner of Hispania to Rome and to each other. Cities rose with their characteristic Roman grid plans, their forums, amphitheatres, aqueducts, and public baths. The aqueduct of Segovia, which still stands today in extraordinary preservation, carries water across a valley on arches nearly 30 metres high, and reminds every visitor that the Romans were not playing around when it came to engineering. Hispania became one of the most thoroughly Romanized provinces in the empire. Latin replaced local languages. Roman law structured social relationships. Roman religion overlaid local cults. The economy was integrated into the vast Mediterranean trading system. Hispania also gave Rome some of its greatest figures. The emperors Trajan and Hadrian were both born in Hispania. The philosopher Seneca was a native of Cordoba. The poet Martial came from the peninsula. The rhetorician Quintilian shaped the teaching of Latin for centuries from his Iberian origins. This was not a provincial backwater. It was a core part of the Roman world. Then in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, as the Western Roman Empire strained under pressure from all sides, new peoples began to move through Hispania. The Vandals crossed through on their way to North Africa. The Suebi established a kingdom in the northwest. The Alans appeared briefly, and finally in the early 5th century the Visigoths arrived. The Visigoths were a Germanic people who had long been in contact with Rome, serving in Roman armies, absorbing Roman culture, and converting to Christianity, though to the Arian variant that the Roman Church would later declare heretical. They established their kingdom with its capital at Toledo in the centre of the peninsula, and ruled Hispania for roughly 3 centuries, from the early 5th century to 711. Their rule was in many ways a continuation of Roman administrative traditions rather than a complete break. Latin remained the language of the church and of governance. Roman law was adapted rather than discarded. The population of Romano-Iberian origin vastly outnumbered the Visigothic newcomers. The Visigothic kingdom was not peaceful or particularly stable. Royal succession was contested repeatedly, with nobles assassinating kings and placing new ones on the throne with alarming regularity. There was also the question of religion. The Visigoths converted from Arianism to Catholic Christianity in 589 under King Recared, which brought them into closer alignment with their Roman Iberian subjects, but also entangled the monarchy deeply with the Catholic Church. Jews living in Hispania faced increasing persecution under Visigothic rule, pressured to convert and facing severe legal disabilities when they did not. By the early 8th century, the Visigothic kingdom was in one of its periodic crises. A disputed succession had split the nobility into factions, and one of those factions made a decision with consequences no one could have imagined. They invited help from across the narrow strait of water that separated Hispania from Africa. The help that arrived would change the peninsula forever. It is worth pausing here to appreciate what Hispania was by this point. It had been shaped by Phoenicians and Greeks, hammered into shape by Rome, layered over by Christianity, governed by Germanic kings. It was already a place of remarkable complexity, already a place where multiple cultures and traditions had collided and mixed. The Spain that would one day build a global empire was still centuries in the future, but the soil in which it would grow had been prepared by thousands of years of exactly this kind of accumulation. Every civilization leaves something behind. The Romans left their language and their roads and their legal thinking. The Visigoths left their contribution to the Christian tradition that would define Spanish identity so deeply. The deeper, older layers of Iberian and Celtiberian and Carthaginian presence left their traces in the landscape, in the bloodlines, in the particular stubborn character that the peninsula seemed to breed in its people. The peninsula was never simply a quiet corner of the world. It was always a contested, dynamic, complicated place where civilizations met and sometimes crashed into one another. That was its nature before Spain existed, and that nature would shape everything that came after. The Moorish world and Al-Andalus. In 711, something happened on the Iberian Peninsula that would define the next 8 centuries of its history. A Muslim army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar from North Africa. The strait at its narrowest point is only about 14 kilometers wide. On a clear day you can see one shore from the other. It is not a dramatic barrier, and in 711 it proved no barrier at all. The general who led that crossing was called Tariq ibn Ziyad, and the rock he crossed to is named after him to this day. Gibraltar comes from Jabal al-Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, which gives you some sense of how thoroughly that moment lodged itself in the geography and memory of the region. Tariq commanded perhaps 7,000 men, mostly Berbers from North Africa, who had themselves only recently converted to Islam. Behind them came larger forces under the Arab governor Musa ibn Nusayr. Within a decade, the Visigothic kingdom had essentially ceased to exist. Weakened by years of factional infighting and unable to mount a unified defence, it crumbled with startling speed. The Muslim forces did not stop in Hispania. They pushed north into what is now France, and were only halted at the Battle of Tours in 732 by the Frankish leader Charles Martel. That battle has been described, with some historical exaggeration, as the moment that stopped Islam from overrunning Europe. The reality is more complicated, but the symbolic weight of that confrontation still echoes. Back in Iberia, the territory under Muslim control was called Al-Andalus, a name whose origins are still debated. It may derive from the Vandals who passed through the region centuries earlier, or possibly from a Gothic term, or possibly from something else entirely. Historians still argue about it, which is one of the genuine pleasures of history. The important thing is not where the name came from, but what Al-Andalus became, which was one of the most remarkable civilizations in the medieval world. The society that developed was genuinely diverse. Arab soldiers and administrators formed the upper stratum. Berber warriors made up the bulk of the military and often harboured deep resentment toward Arab elites despite their shared faith. Below them were the native Hispano-Roman and Visigothic descendants, some of whom converted to Islam and others of whom retained their Christianity as dhimmis, protected peoples who paid a special tax but were generally allowed to practice their faith. Jews, long present in Hispania and badly treated under the Visigoths, found a significantly more tolerant environment and played important roles in scholarship, medicine, and trade. This was, in other words, a genuinely pluralistic society, at least by the standards of its age. It was not utopian. There were persecutions and serious tensions. The status of non-Muslims was always formally subordinate. But compared to most of medieval Europe, Al-Andalus at its height offered a degree of coexistence that was unusual and genuinely productive. The political and cultural heart of this civilization was Córdoba. And Córdoba in the 10th century was not merely important, it was extraordinary. When Abd al-Rahman III declared himself Caliph of Córdoba in 929, he established the city as the capital of an independent Islamic state, whose scale and sophistication left contemporary observers struggling for adequate words. Its population may have reached 500,000 at its peak, making it the largest city in Europe, rivaling Constantinople. For context, London in this same period had perhaps 15,000 inhabitants. The contrast is almost comic. Córdoba had paved streets at a time when other European cities had mud tracks. It had public lighting, running water, hundreds of mosques, and dozens of public baths. Its library allegedly contained 400,000 volumes when the great libraries of Christian Europe might contain a few hundred carefully copied manuscripts. The intellectual life it supported was what set Al-Andalus most dramatically apart. Muslim scholars here were translating and commenting on the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Euclid at a time when most of these texts were simply unknown in Christian Europe. Ibn Rushd, known in the Latin West as Averroes, wrote commentaries on Aristotle so influential that when they reached Christian universities in the 12th and 13th centuries, They essentially reinvented European philosophy. Maimonides, the greatest Jewish philosopher of the medieval period, was born in Cordoba in 1135. This was a culture actively building knowledge, translating, synthesizing, arguing, and discovering, and crucially, much of that knowledge eventually flowed northward, helping to ignite the intellectual revolutions that led, in time, to the scientific revolution itself. The agricultural innovations were equally lasting. The Muslims brought new crops to Iberia, including oranges, lemons, sugarcane, rice, and saffron. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems that turned arid land into productive gardens. The Spanish word for irrigation channel, acequia, comes from Arabic, so do dozens of other Spanish words related to water, architecture, and daily life. Every time a Spanish speaker says ojalá, meaning hopefully, they are using an Arabic phrase from these centuries, preserved in the language like a fossil in stone. The architecture endures in ways that still astonish. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, the Mezquita, is an interior space unlike almost anything else in the world. Its famous forest of columns topped with striped red and white arches, creating an effect that is simultaneously geometric and mysterious. The Alhambra Palace in Granada, built by the last Muslim dynasty in Iberia, combines delicate arcades, inscribed geometric patterns, and water channels running through tiled rooms into an experience of extraordinary refinement. They are the most visited monuments in Spain today. They represent what Al-Andalus left behind, the final statement of a civilization that, even in decline, had lost none of its ambition. Because decline did come. The caliphate fragmented in the early 11th century into dozens of small competing kingdoms called taifa states, each spending enormous energy on intrigue and warfare against neighbours. That fragmentation gave the Christian kingdoms of the north the opening they had been waiting for. But before that story overtakes this one, it is worth sitting for a moment with what Al-Andalus had been, a civilization of genuine brilliance, a society where three faiths had lived together in complicated but often creative tension for centuries, a culture that, even in defeat, left permanent marks on everything that replaced it. The Reconquista, 7 centuries of holy war, while Al-Andalus was building its libraries and its irrigation systems in its extraordinary city of Cordoba, something was happening in the cold mountains of the north that the scholars down south might have been forgiven for not taking entirely seriously. In the Cantabrian Mountains and the Pyrenees and the high plateaus below them, small Christian communities had survived the Muslim conquest and had, over generations, begun to push back. The traditional starting point of the Reconquista, the Reconquest, is the Battle of Covadonga, fought somewhere in the Asturian mountains in 718 or 722, depending on which source you trust. A Visigothic noble named Pelayo led a small force against a Muslim army, and won, or at least avoided losing, which in that particular context amounted to much the same thing. Pelayo founded the Kingdom of Asturias, claiming it as the legitimate successor of the Visigothic kingdom, and that claim, however tenuous in those early years, gave the resistance movement its ideological foundation. They were not simply fighting for survival or for land. They were fighting to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. This foundational myth shaped everything that followed. The Reconquista was not merely a military process. It was a process of identity formation. The Christians of the north came to define themselves in opposition to the Muslims of the south, their faith becoming the thing that most fundamentally distinguished them and made their cause righteous. Over centuries that identity hardened into something fierce and exclusive, a sense that Christian Spain had to be defended and purified from contamination, that hardening would eventually produce the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In its early centuries, the Reconquista was less a coordinated holy war than a slow, messy process of expansion, colonization, and occasional catastrophic reversal. The kingdoms of the north grew gradually. Asturias expanded and eventually split into Leon and Castile. Aragon developed in the northeast. Navarre bridged the central Pyrenees. Portugal took shape as a distinct entity in the 12th century. Progress southward was never constant. The Almoravids crossed from Morocco in 1086 and reversed many Christian gains. The Almohads did the same in the 12th century. Both represented a radicalization of Islam in North Africa that found the Taifa kingdoms decadent and brought renewed military vigor to the conflict. The Christian side had its own legendary figures. The greatest of them, and one of the most complicated figures in all of Spanish historical memory, is Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known as El Cid, a name that comes from the Arabic Sayyid, meaning lord. El Cid was a Castilian knight whose career defies easy categorization. He fought for Christian kings and Muslim kings, was exiled from the Castilian court twice, and ended his life ruling Valencia essentially as an independent lord. The epic poem written about him presents the ideal Christian knight, loyal and noble and pious. The historical El Cid was considerably more pragmatic, which makes him more interesting, but less useful as a symbol of holy war. Spain chose the symbol anyway. It usually does. The great turning point came in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 broke the power of the Almohad dynasty and opened Andalusia to Christian conquest. Ferdinand III of Castile captured Córdoba in 1236 and Seville in 1248. By the mid-13th century, the Muslim presence in Iberia had been reduced to the Emirate of Granada, a surviving state in the southeastern corner that managed another 250 years by paying tribute, playing kingdoms against each other, and maintaining the Nasrid dynasty through a combination of diplomacy and remarkable good fortune. The social patterns left by the Reconquista endured for centuries. Conquered land was distributed to the knights and nobles who had fought for it, creating a military aristocracy that associated land with honour and conquest, rather than with labour. Towns received charters granting freedoms in exchange for serving as frontier fortresses. The military orders, the Knights of Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara, were founded as warrior monks dedicated to the Reconquista and given vast estates in the south. The cities that developed were fundamentally frontier societies, each neighbourhood built around its church or mosque or synagogue, each community maintaining its identity within the larger whole. This system, called convivencia by historians, meaning coexistence, was not always peaceful but was for long periods genuinely functional. Christian, Muslim and Jewish craftsmen worked side by side. Kings kept advisors of all three faiths. The Toledo School of Translators in the 12th and 13th centuries, where scholars from all three communities collaborated to translate Arabic and Greek texts into Latin, was one of the most important intellectual institutions of the medieval world. But convivencia was always fragile. Anti-Jewish violence culminated in the terrible pogroms of 1391, killing thousands and forcing many more to convert. The converts, called conversos, remained under suspicion. The idea that blood rather than faith was the true marker of Christian identity began hardening into the concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, which would shape Spanish society for centuries. By the late 15th century, 700 years of reconquest had left most of the peninsula in Christian hands, with only Granada remaining. The kingdoms that had grown through this long struggle had developed distinct cultures and an intense sense of purpose. They were about to be joined in a union that would transform not just Spain but the entire world. And the people who would make that union were about to get married, or at least agree to a politically advantageous arrangement, which in the 15th century often came to exactly the same thing. Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs. In 1469, two young people got married in the city of Valladolid. He was 17 years old and king of Sicily, heir to the throne of Aragon. She was 18 years old and heir to the throne of Castile. Their names were Ferdinand and Isabella, and their marriage, which they had arranged themselves against the wishes of powerful interests on both sides, would eventually be recognised as one of the most consequential events in European history. It did not look that way immediately. Isabella had to fight a civil war to claim her throne, battling against a rival claimant supported by Portugal. Ferdinand was simultaneously dealing with the complexities of Aragonese politics, which were considerably more contractual and constrained than Castilian royal authority. Aragon was actually a confederation of territories, each with its own laws and institutions, and its kings operated under real constitutional limitations, a fact that would matter considerably later. Isabella won her civil war by 1479, the same year Ferdinand inherited Aragon from his father. In that year, for the first time, the crowns of Castile and Aragon were held by the same royal couple. It is important to understand what this did and did not mean. Spain as a unified state did not exist in 1479. Castile and Aragon remained legally distinct kingdoms with separate institutions, separate laws, separate courtiers, the representative assemblies, and separate identities. Ferdinand and Isabella ruled together, but they ruled different kingdoms that happened to share monarchs. The process of actual unification was slow and incomplete for generations. Even today, the regional identities of Castile, Aragon, Catalonia, and the Basque country remain powerful forces in Spanish politics, which tells you something about how deep those old distinctions run. But the union of the crowns was enormously significant in practical terms. It combined the military manpower and territorial expanse of Castile, the largest Iberian kingdom, with the commercial wealth and Mediterranean connections of Aragon, which controlled Valencia, Catalonia, and possessions in Italy including Sardinia, Sicily, and eventually the Kingdom of Naples. It also gave the monarchs the combined resources to complete the Reconquista. Ferdinand and Isabella attacked Granada beginning in 1482, with a campaign that would last a decade. Granada was a sophisticated, wealthy, and well-defended state. The Nasrid Emirate had survived for 250 years by political cunning and geography, nestled between the mountains and the sea with formidable fortifications. But it was internally divided, with a disputed succession that split the ruling family into factions, and it was now facing the full combined military force of a unified Castile and Aragon. The war was grinding and attritional, fought through a series of sieges as the Christian armies slowly reduced the mountain fortresses one by one. The famous general Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, later known as El Gran Capitán, developed the military innovations in this campaign that would make Spanish armies the most formidable in Europe for the next century and a half. On the 2nd of January 1492, the last emir of Granada, Mohammed Thuin, known to later Spanish tradition as Boabdil, handed over the keys of the Alhambra Palace to Ferdinand and Isabella. The Reconquista was over. 781 years after Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the strait, the Muslim political presence in Iberia had ended. According to a famous story, Boabdil wept as he looked back at the Alhambra for the last time, and his mother said to him, "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." It is almost certainly apocryphal. It has been repeated for 5 centuries nonetheless. History loves a good exit line. 1492 was a year of remarkable consequence. Within months of the fall of Granada, 3 other things of world historical significance had happened. In March, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra decree ordering the expulsion of all Jews from their territories who refused to convert to Christianity. In August, Christopher Columbus sailed westward from the port of Palos, and throughout the year the Spanish Inquisition, already a decade old, was tightening its grip on religious life across the kingdom. Let us take the Inquisition first, because it is too important and too misunderstood to rush past. The Spanish Inquisition was established in 1478, with papal approval to investigate the sincerity of Jewish converts to Christianity, the conversos, who were suspected of secretly continuing to practice Judaism while outwardly conforming to Christian requirements. This was not simply paranoid bigotry, though there was plenty of that involved. Many conversions had been made under duress during the violence of 1391, and there is genuine evidence that some conversos did maintain Jewish practices in private. The question of how to manage this situation in a society that had made religious uniformity central to its political identity was real and difficult. The Spanish Inquisition's answer was to create a court with the power to investigate, try, and punish those found guilty of heresy. Its procedures involved torture to extract confessions, imprisonment, confiscation of property, and in the most serious cases execution, usually by burning. The numbers of executions have been debated by historians for a long time. Earlier estimates were sometimes vastly inflated by anti-Catholic propaganda, particularly in Protestant countries. More careful modern scholarship suggests that the Inquisition executed perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people over its 3.5 centuries of existence, which is considerably fewer than some earlier claims, but still represents thousands of human lives destroyed by judicial terror. And the fear it generated, the surveillance it imposed, the demand for ideological conformity it enforced, were themselves deeply damaging to intellectual and cultural life regardless of the death count. The Inquisition also investigated old Christians accused of various heresies, later became concerned with Moriscos, the descendants of Muslim converts, and with Protestants who appeared in Spain after the Reformation. It became in some respects the enforcement arm of the concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, which demanded that those holding public office, church positions, or university places demonstrate that they had no recent Jewish or Muslim ancestry. This was racial discrimination of the most systematic kind, and it drove talented people from public life, encouraged obsessive genealogical anxiety, and poisoned Spanish society with suspicion. The expulsion of the Jews in 1492 was the logical culmination of this trajectory. Between 150,000 and 200,000 Jews were given the choice between conversion and exile. Many chose exile, dispersing across the Mediterranean, to North Africa, to Italy, to the Ottoman Empire, whose Sultan Bayezid II famously said that Ferdinand was being praised as a wise king while impoverishing his country and enriching his enemies. The expelled Jews, known as Sephardim, from the Hebrew word for Hispania, maintained their Spanish language, their customs, and their memory of Spain for centuries. Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish language, was still being spoken in Ottoman communities in the early 20th century, a linguistic fossil of medieval Castile preserved in exile. The expulsion removed from Spain a community that had contributed enormously to its intellectual, financial, and cultural life for over a millennium. It was an act of profound self-mutilation dressed up as pious necessity. These things happen in history with a frequency that should disturb us. Societies convincing themselves that their strength requires the removal of their most capable minorities. The consequences, as they usually do, took time to become fully apparent. Ferdinand and Isabella were called the Catholic monarchs by Pope Alexander VI, a title awarded for their religious policies and their completion of the Reconquista. They were, by the standards of their time, extraordinarily able rulers. Isabella in particular was a monarch of considerable intelligence, political skill, and genuine piety. She managed the complex politics of Castile with remarkable effectiveness, reformed the church, patronized learning and the arts, and maintained a court of genuine cultural distinction. She was also responsible for some of the most terrible decisions of her reign: the Inquisition, the expulsion, and the authorization of Columbus's voyage and everything that followed from it. History is rarely comfortable enough to give us villains and heroes without complication. Isabella is a test case in that difficulty. Ferdinand was a different character, more coldly pragmatic, less personally warm, more clearly political in his calculations. The political theorist Niccolò Machiavelli, who was watching him carefully from Florence, essentially used Ferdinand as the model for the calculating, realistic prince in his famous handbook for rulers. Ferdinand expanded Spanish power in Italy, played the great powers of Europe against each other with considerable skill, and was calculating about religion in a way that Isabella was not. He also governed for decades after Isabella's death in 1504, first as regent of Castile, and then through his own political manoeuvring, ensuring that the kingdoms he and Isabella had joined remained joined. By the time Ferdinand died in 1516, the foundations had been laid for something entirely new. The Spanish kingdoms had a proven capacity for organized military conquest. They had a church deeply tied to their political identity and committed to enforcing religious uniformity. They had an ideology that combined Christian mission with royal authority into something almost invincible in its self-certainty. And they had, by 1492, discovered a new world that would make all of their existing ambitions look modest. Columbus and the collision of worlds. Christopher Columbus was Genoese by birth, had spent years living in Portugal, and arrived in Spain in 1485 with an idea that was not, despite the myth, considered crazy by everyone who heard it. The idea that the Earth was round was not controversial among educated Europeans in the 15th century. The ancient Greeks had worked out the spherical nature of the Earth well enough, and medieval European scholars had not forgotten it. What was controversial about Columbus's proposal was his arithmetic. Columbus believed that the distance from Europe to Asia, sailing westward, was much shorter than most geographers calculated. He had significantly underestimated the circumference of the Earth, and had, in a crucial navigational error, confused the Arabic mile with the shorter Roman mile in his calculations. The experts who reviewed his proposal for the Portuguese crown in the early 1480s rejected it, not because they thought the Earth was flat, but because they thought, correctly, that Columbus's proposed route was far too long for any ship of the period to sail without stopping for supplies. They were right about this. Had the Americas not been in the way, Columbus's expedition would almost certainly have run out of food and water somewhere in the Pacific. The Spanish commission that reviewed his proposal also had doubts, and Columbus spent years at the Spanish court trying to get his expedition approved and funded. He was helped by the patronage of the Duke of Medina Celi, and eventually by the direct support of Queen Isabella, who agreed to fund the expedition in 1492, possibly in the mood of post-Reconquista euphoria that followed the fall of Granada. Columbus drove a remarkably hard bargain for a man asking for royal patronage. He demanded the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the rank of Viceroy over any lands he discovered, and 10% of all revenues from those lands. The Spanish crown accepted these terms probably assuming he would find nothing and that the titles would be worthless. On the 3rd of August 1492, Columbus sailed from the port of Palos with 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, and roughly 90 men. He stopped at the Canary Islands to resupply and then sailed west into the unknown. Or not exactly unknown. Columbus had studied the accounts of previous Atlantic voyages, knew about the Azores and the Canaries, and had theories about wind patterns that proved largely correct. The trade winds blew steadily west from the latitude of the Canaries, which is exactly the route he followed. He was navigating intelligently, not blindly. The crossing took 33 days. On the morning of the 12th of October 1492, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana on the Pinta sighted land. It was an island in what we now call the Bahamas. Columbus named it San Salvador. He went ashore carrying the royal banner of Castile and a notary to record the formal act of possession. He was taking possession of land that was already inhabited by people who had been living there for thousands of years, the Taino, whom Columbus called Indians because he believed he had reached the outer islands of Asia. This misidentification had enormous consequences. Columbus went to his death in 1506 still insisting, in the face of considerable evidence to the contrary, that he had reached Asia. It was Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine navigator who explored the South American coast in the late 1490s and early 1500s, who argued clearly that this was a previously unknown continent, a new world. The name America comes from him, which Columbus might have found annoying. But the immediate reality of that October morning in 1492 was a meeting between 2 worlds that had been separated for perhaps 15,000 years, since the first humans crossed from Asia to the Americas across the land bridge that once existed where the Bering Strait now lies. The Taino people who encountered Columbus's ships had no framework for understanding what these strange vessels were or who these pale strangers were. Columbus had no accurate framework for understanding the peoples he encountered, whom he viewed through the lens of European assumptions about savages, exotic kingdoms, and the proximity of Asia. Both sides were working with profound misunderstandings and no shared language. The interpreters Columbus had brought were useless, having been brought to help him communicate with Arabic or Asian speakers. Columbus's first voyage took him through the Caribbean, landing at Cuba and Hispaniola. The island now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. He was received with curiosity and hospitality by the Taino, whom he immediately began to size up as potential slaves and as leads to the gold he was desperately seeking. He found some gold, enough to suggest that more existed, built a small fort on Hispaniola, left a garrison of men there and sailed back to Spain in early 1493. He arrived in triumph. The news of his discoveries spread across Europe with extraordinary speed, carried partly by a letter Columbus wrote that was printed and reprinted dozens of times in multiple languages. Whatever he had found, it was new. It was claimed for Spain, and it seemed to promise enormous wealth. Ferdinand and Isabella received him at court with great ceremony, and the negotiations with Portugal over competing claims to the newly discovered territories moved quickly to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the world between the 2 Iberian powers along a line drawn through the Atlantic. Everything to the west of the line would be Spain's, everything to the east Portugal's. The line was drawn far enough west that Brazil, when it was reached by Pedro Álvares Cabral in 1500, fell just to the Portuguese side, which is why Brazilians speak Portuguese today rather than Spanish. Columbus made 3 more voyages. On his second, he found his Hispaniola garrison massacred, probably in retaliation for the abuses they had committed against the local population. He established a new settlement, began the systematic exploitation of Taino labour through a system of forced work, and started sending enslaved people back to Spain, over Isabella's objections. She returned them and explicitly forbade the enslavement of her new subjects, though this prohibition proved essentially unenforceable in practice. On his 3rd voyage, Columbus reached the South American mainland for the first time, touching the coast of Venezuela. On his 4th and last voyage, he explored the coasts of Central America, still looking for a passage to Asia. Columbus was a brilliant navigator and a disastrous colonial administrator. He was arrested by a royal investigator in 1500 for his mismanagement of Hispaniola, and sent back to Spain in chains, though he was subsequently released and his titles and revenues partially restored. He died in Valladolid in 1506, still believing he had reached Asia, still arguing with the crown over the rewards he had been promised, still insisting on his titles and his 10%. He was not poor at the end of his life, but he was aggrieved, and he had good reason to feel that the enormous consequences of his voyages had not translated into the personal recognition and reward he thought he deserved. What those voyages had set in motion was beyond anything Columbus or anyone else in Europe in 1506 could have fully grasped. The Americas were not an appendage to the known world. They were a hemisphere, enormously larger and more complex than anything European imaginations had prepared them for. They contained civilizations of astonishing sophistication. They contained populations in the tens of millions. They contained ecological systems entirely different from anything in Eurasia or Africa. They contained resources that would eventually make Spain the wealthiest and most powerful state in the world. They also contained diseases, and the diseases Columbus and his sailors and all the Europeans who followed them brought to the Americas were the most catastrophic biological event in human history. The indigenous populations of the Americas had developed in isolation from the diseases of the Old World, which meant they had no acquired immunity to smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and the dozens of other infectious diseases that had become endemic in Eurasia and Africa after thousands of years of living in close contact with domesticated animals. When European diseases arrived in the Americas, they spread through populations with no resistance whatsoever. The mortality rates were staggering, sometimes reaching 90% in affected communities within a generation. Before any European had even set foot in many parts of the Americas, disease had spread ahead of them, killing millions. The demographic catastrophe that followed Columbus's first voyage was not a side effect of empire building. It was a fundamental precondition for it. Without the collapse of indigenous populations from disease, the Spanish conquest would have been far more difficult, possibly impossible in many regions. The Americas that Cortés and Pizarro found were not the Americas that had existed in 1491. They were already shattered worlds, reeling from epidemics that had killed huge proportions of their populations and disrupted their political structures. This is not to minimize what the Spanish did. It is to insist on the full complexity of what happened. The conquistadors: ambition, gold, and ruin. The word conquistador means conqueror in Spanish. It is a straightforward word for what was often a straightforward process. Men came from Spain to the Americas with weapons and horses and dogs trained for war, and a belief in their absolute right to take whatever they found, and they took it. The story is more complicated than that in its details and its human texture, but that is the basic shape of it. The conquistadors were not, for the most part, the grandees of Spanish society. They were younger sons of minor noble families, landless adventurers, soldiers who had served in Italy or in the final campaigns of the Reconquista and found themselves without occupation, men from the lower reaches of the Spanish hidalgia, that class of technically noble but often poor gentlemen who had been defined by military service and despised manual labour. The Americas offered them something that Spain could not: the chance to become lords through conquest rather than through inheritance. The first theatre of serious conquest was the Caribbean, where the island of Hispaniola served as the base for operations that spread to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. The Taino population of these islands was effectively destroyed within a few decades of contact through a combination of disease, overwork in the encomienda system of forced labour, and direct violence. By the 1520s, the Caribbean islands that Columbus had described as full of people were largely depopulated of their original inhabitants, and the Spanish had already begun importing enslaved Africans to replace the labour force they had destroyed. But it was the mainland that produced the events that most profoundly shaped the Spanish Empire. Hernán Cortés was born in Medellín, in Extremadura, the poor, dry, tough southwestern province of Castile, that produced a remarkable proportion of the conquistadors, possibly because it was poor, dry, and tough, and gave its young men excellent reasons to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Cortés studied law briefly, abandoned it, sailed to the Caribbean in 1504, served in the conquest of Cuba under Diego Velázquez, and by 1518 had acquired enough of a reputation and enough of a restless ambition to be given command of an expedition to the Mexican coast. Velázquez then changed his mind and revoked his commission, possibly correctly surmising that Cortés was not the kind of man to take orders. Cortés ignored the revocation and sailed anyway. In February 1519, Cortés landed on the Mexican coast with roughly 550 soldiers, a few horses, and some artillery. What lay to the west of him, though he did not know it yet, was the Aztec Empire, one of the most formidable political and military organizations in the Americas, a state that controlled or extracted tribute from millions of people across a vast area of central Mexico. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, built on an island in a lake, was a city of perhaps 200,000 people, which would have made it larger than any city in Europe at the time except possibly Constantinople. The story of how Cortés and his small force managed to conquer this enormous empire is one of the most extraordinary in human history, and it cannot be explained by Spanish military superiority alone, though Spanish weapons, horses, and tactical flexibility were certainly important factors. The key to understanding the conquest is the political structure of the Aztec Empire itself. The Aztec Empire was built on a system of tribute and intimidation rather than direct rule. Many of the peoples who paid tribute to Tenochtitlan did so resentfully, and when a charismatic Spanish commander appeared offering an alternative, significant numbers of them were willing to become his allies. By the time Cortés reached Tenochtitlan in November 1519, he was marching at the head of an army in which the Spanish were a small minority and indigenous allies. Many of them from Tlaxcala, which had successfully resisted Aztec domination, formed the overwhelming majority. There was also the extraordinary factor of Malinche, or Doña Marina as the Spanish called her, a Nahua woman given to Cortés as a slave who spoke both Nahuatl and Mayan, and who learned Spanish with remarkable speed. She became Cortés's interpreter, advisor, and partner, and her role in the conquest was so central that later Mexican tradition would make her simultaneously the mother of the Mexican nation, through her relationship with Cortés and their son Martín, and the archetypal traitor whose cooperation with the conquerors made their victory possible. She is one of the most ambivalent figures in the history of the Americas, neither hero nor villain, but something irreducibly human and irreducibly complex. Cortés entered Tenochtitlan as a guest of the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II. What followed has been interpreted and reinterpreted endlessly. The famous story that Moctezuma believed Cortés to be the returning god Quetzalcoatl is probably largely a post-conquest fabrication or distortion. More likely, Moctezuma was managing a dangerous situation with the political tools available to him, and those tools proved inadequate. Cortés took Moctezuma hostage within his own palace, a move of staggering audacity, and for months managed the enormous city of Tenochtitlan through this captive emperor, while his own position remained precarious and ultimately untenable. The situation exploded in June 1520, the Night of Sorrows, La Noche Triste, when an uprising by the people of Tenochtitlan, inflamed by a massacre committed by one of Cortés's lieutenants during a religious ceremony, forced the Spanish and their allies to flee the city under fire. They lost enormous numbers of men, and nearly all their equipment and gold. Cortés is said to have sat under a tree outside the city and wept. He then reorganized his forces, built a fleet of boats to control the lake, gathered more indigenous allies, and launched a systematic siege of Tenochtitlan that lasted 3 months. By August 1521, Tenochtitlan had fallen. The city was in ruins, its population decimated by smallpox and starvation during the siege. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured trying to escape by canoe. Cortés had conquered an empire. Mexico City was built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, using stones from Aztec temples to construct Spanish churches and palaces, which tells you something essential about the psychology of conquest. You do not just defeat your enemy, you build your world on top of theirs. If the conquest of Mexico was extraordinary, the conquest of Peru was something approaching the impossible. Francisco Pizarro was from a poor family in Extremadura, possibly illegitimate, almost certainly illiterate for most of his life, and had been in the Americas since the earliest years of the conquest. He had participated in the conquest of Darien, had heard stories about a fabulously wealthy kingdom to the south, and in 1532, with a force of about 168 men, he descended into the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire was the largest state in the pre-Columbian Americas, stretching 4,000 kilometers along the western coast of South America, from what is now southern Colombia to central Chile. It was administered through a system of roads, relay runners, and storehouses, with a sophistication that deeply impressed the Spanish when they understood what they were seeing, which was admittedly after they had already destroyed it. The empire had a population of perhaps 12 million people. In November 1532, Pizarro captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa at the city of Cajamarca in what must rank among the most audacious and brutal acts in military history. He invited Atahualpa to a meeting, surrounded the square with his small force and with artillery, gave a priest to read the Requerimiento, a legal document explaining Christianity and the authority of the Pope and the Spanish crown, to a man who had no context for understanding any of it, and who received it with entirely justified contempt, and then, when Atahualpa dismissed the document, opened fire. In the ensuing massacre, the Spanish killed perhaps 2,000 unarmed Inca attendants and captured Atahualpa without losing a single man. The Requerimiento deserves a special mention. It was a document that conquistadors were legally required to read to indigenous peoples before attacking them, giving them the chance to accept Spanish sovereignty and Christianity voluntarily. If they refused or didn't understand, the Spanish were within their legal rights to wage war against them and enslave them. It was read sometimes to people who spoke no Spanish. It was sometimes read to empty forests or to the sea from ships offshore. It was a piece of legal theatre that allowed the Spanish crown to maintain that its conquests were just while providing no practical protection whatsoever to the people being conquered. Even Spanish critics at the time found it grotesque. Atahualpa offered to fill the room in which he was imprisoned with gold, up to a line he drew on the wall, and twice that volume in silver in exchange for his freedom. The Spanish accepted, spent months collecting the ransom, received gold and silver in quantities that astonished even men who had come specifically looking for treasure, and then executed Atahualpa anyway on trumped-up charges in July 1533. It was a defining act of bad faith that established the template for much of what followed. From these two great conquests flowed everything else. Mexico and Peru were the hearts of the new Spanish colonial world. Their silver and gold funded the Spanish Empire for a century and a half. Their populations, decimated by disease and exploitation, were organized into the labor systems that extracted those resources. Their cultures were systematically suppressed, their temples demolished, their records burned, their languages marginalized. And in their ruins, a new society began to emerge, mestizo, mixed, Spanish-speaking, Catholic, neither entirely European nor entirely indigenous, shaped by the collision of worlds in ways that are still being understood. The conquistadors who followed Cortés and Pizarro explored and conquered an enormous swathe of the Americas. Hernando de Soto explored the American southeast from Florida to the Mississippi River. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado pushed north through what is now Arizona and New Mexico in search of the legendary 7 cities of gold, which do not exist. Francisco de Orellana navigated the entire length of the Amazon River. Sebastián de Benalcázar conquered Quito. Pedro de Alvarado fought his way through Guatemala and El Salvador with a ferocity that shocked even hardened contemporaries. The Americas were being mapped, claimed, and devastated at a pace that suggests something close to collective madness. The gold and silver that the conquistadors found were real. The fabulous wealth of the Aztec and Inca emperors was real. But many of the conquistadors themselves died poor, in debt, in litigation with the Spanish crown over their rewards, or killed by their own companions in quarrels over plunder. The romantic image of the conquistador as a swashbuckling hero of discovery is a Spanish cultural invention of the 19th and 20th centuries. The reality was more often squalid, brutal, and disappointed, building the empire, administration, silver, and the New World Order. Conquering an empire and governing one are two entirely different challenges, and the Spanish discovered this quickly. The conquistadors were excellent at destruction, and rather poor at construction. They were soldiers and adventurers, not bureaucrats. But the Spanish crown, increasingly alarmed by the autonomous power that men like Cortés and Pizarro were accumulating, moved quickly to assert royal control over the new territories. The theoretical framework for this control was provided by a body of law and administration that the Spanish developed with considerable sophistication over the 16th century. The Council of the Indies, established in 1524, became the supreme governing body for all of Spain's American territories, handling legislation, judicial appeals, appointments to major offices, and oversight of the colonial economy. It sat in Spain, which meant that everything happened at a remove from the actual territories being governed, with a lag of months for communications to travel across the Atlantic. This was a structural problem that never went away. The Americas were divided into viceroyalties, vast territories each governed by a viceroy who served as the direct representative of the crown. The Viceroyalty of New Spain, centered on Mexico City, was established in 1535. The Viceroyalty of Peru, centered on Lima, was established in 1542. Each viceroy presided over a hierarchy of lesser officials, courts called audiencias that handled legal matters, local town councils, and the church hierarchy, which was deeply involved in governance as well as religion. The system was designed to keep power firmly in the hands of men appointed by the crown and removable by it, rather than allowing the development of hereditary noble power in the Americas. The heirs of the conquistadors resented this bitterly, and there were several serious rebellions, including the revolt of the Pizarro brothers in Peru in the 1540s, which had to be suppressed by military force. The crown was determined not to allow a new feudal class to develop in the Americas that would be beyond its control, and it was largely successful in this aim, though the cost was constant friction between colonial elites and royal officials. The economic engine of the empire was silver. The Spanish had found gold in the Caribbean and in the treasuries of the Aztec and Inca empires, but the truly transformative wealth came from silver mining. Two great mining centers dominated the colonial economy. Potosí, in what is now Bolivia, discovered in 1545, was the richest silver deposit in the world. At its peak in the 1600s, it was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population of around 160,000 people, a remarkable fact for a city sitting at over 4,000 meters altitude in the high Andean plateau. The conditions in the mines were appalling. Indigenous workers, drafted under the meter system, a Spanish adaptation of an Inca labor obligation, worked in shafts hundreds of meters deep, breathing toxic mercury fumes from the amalgamation process used to separate silver from ore, dying in enormous numbers from accidents, lung disease, and mercury poisoning. The Spanish said that the silver road from Potosí to the coast was paved with the bones of indigenous workers. They were not joking. Zacatecas in northern Mexico, discovered in 1546, was the other great silver center, eventually supplying a substantial portion of the world's silver. Between them, Potosí and Zacatecas produced quantities of silver that transformed the global economy. The total amount of silver shipped from the Americas to Spain between 1500 and 1800 has been estimated at over 100,000 tons. This was not merely a lot of silver. It was enough to change the money supply of the entire world. It caused inflation across Europe as the purchasing power of silver fell with the increase in its supply. It funded the Spanish crown's wars and ambitions for a century, and through Spain's trade connections it flowed eastward through Europe into the Ottoman Empire and eventually to China, where silver was the primary medium of exchange, creating what historians have described as the first truly global economy. The Manila galleon trade, established after the Spanish colonized the Philippines in the 1560s, created a direct Pacific trade route between Acapulco in Mexico and Manila in the Philippines. Each year, great galleons carried American silver westward and returned with Chinese silks, porcelains, and spices. This route knitted together the Pacific world in a commercial network that moved an estimated 30% of all American silver production into Chinese hands over the following 2.5 centuries. When you think about the foundations of global trade, they were being laid in the holds of those galleons. The governance of the Americas also involved the Catholic Church in ways that went far beyond the merely spiritual. The Church received the right to collect tithes from the colonial population and accumulated enormous wealth through donations, inheritance, and its own economic activities. Religious orders, the Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians, and later the Jesuits, ran the network of missions that spread Christianity among indigenous peoples and served as the primary institutions of education and cultural transformation. The Church built universities, hospitals, and schools. It also conducted the Inquisition in the Americas, though the American Inquisition was generally less severe than its Spanish counterpart. The missionaries deserve a more complicated assessment than either the harsh critics or the devoted admirers typically provide. Some of them genuinely tried to understand and record indigenous cultures, and we know as much as we do about Aztec and Maya civilization because of the work of scholars like Bernardino de Sahagún and Diego de Landa. Landa also famously burned most of the Maya books he could find, so his relationship to Maya culture was comprehensively ambivalent. The missionaries did, in many cases, genuinely protect indigenous peoples from the worst excesses of colonial exploitation, arguing at the royal court for legislation that would limit the abuses of the encomenderos. The laws of New Spain of 1542, largely the result of campaigning by Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who had begun his career as an encomendero before converting to the cause of indigenous rights, attempted to abolish the encomienda system and were the most ambitious attempt at colonial reform of the 16th century. They were largely ineffective in practice, but they existed, which tells you that the Spanish colonial world was not a monolith of brutality without a voice of conscience, even if that voice often went unheard. The racial hierarchy of colonial Spanish America developed gradually into a system of extraordinary complexity. At the top were the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain, who held the highest offices. Below them were the Criollos, people of Spanish descent born in the Americas, who formed the colonial elite in practical terms but were technically subordinate to peninsulares. Below them were the various categories of mixed ancestry, the castas, a system of classification so elaborate that colonial Spanish America developed an entire genre of paintings, the casta paintings, depicting the various types and their designated names, mestizo for Spanish and indigenous, mulatto for Spanish and African, zambo for indigenous and African, and dozens of further subdivisions. Below the criollos and the castas were the indigenous peoples and the enslaved Africans, whose status was formally distinct, but whose material conditions often overlapped. This system was less rigid in practice than on paper, with money and social connections capable of shifting people up the hierarchy. But it was real, and it was felt. The colonial world organized human beings by origin and color, in ways that would take centuries to even partially dismantle, and whose consequences are visible in Latin American societies today. Chapter 8. Charles V, the man who ruled half the world. In 1516, a 16-year-old Flemish-speaking boy arrived in Spain to claim his inheritance. His name was Carlos, and by the time he was 19 years old, he had collected titles and territories at a pace that no single person in European history had managed before or has managed since. From his Spanish grandparents Ferdinand and Isabella, he inherited Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Granada, and Spain's growing American empire. From his Burgundian grandmother Mary, he inherited the Netherlands, which in the early 16th century was one of the most economically developed and commercially sophisticated regions in Europe. From his Habsburg grandfather Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, he inherited Austria and the Habsburg hereditary lands in Central Europe, and in 1519, following Maximilian's death, he was elected Holy Roman Emperor, the nominal overlord of most of Germany, by a college of German princes who were persuaded by a combination of bribery and the intimidating scale of his existing possessions. Carlos, who became Charles III of Spain, and Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, was now ruler of a collection of territories that encompassed Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Germany, much of Italy, and an expanding American empire. He was the most powerful European monarch since Charlemagne, and possibly the most powerful since the height of the Roman Empire. Nobody had really prepared for this. Not the Spanish, who found themselves suddenly with a Flemish-speaking king who did not even speak Spanish when he arrived, and who had brought a crowd of Flemish favourites to distribute appointments among. Not the Germans, who found themselves with a monarch who was absent far more often than not. Not even Charles himself, who spent most of his reign either at war or travelling between his various territories, living an itinerant existence that covered an almost incomprehensible number of miles across Europe. Charles was, by most accounts, a serious and conscientious ruler who took his responsibilities with genuine weight. He was also, physically, somewhat unprepossessing. He had the famously protruding Habsburg jaw, so severe that he could not close his mouth properly, ate like someone making up for lost time at every meal, and suffered from gout for much of his adult life. The portraits by Titian, who painted him repeatedly, treat him with a respect that does not quite conceal the fact that this was not a physically commanding man. What he had was persistence, organisational ability, and an almost obsessive sense of dynastic duty. His reign was defined by two great struggles that turned out to be deeply connected. The first was the challenge of Protestantism. In 1517, a German Augustinian friar named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg, though historians now debate whether the nailing actually happened or is a later embellishment. This is one of those moments where the historical symbol is probably more important than the precise literal truth of the story. What is unquestionable is that Luther's challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church triggered a religious revolution that split Christian Europe permanently. Charles, as the secular defender of Catholic Christendom, found himself presiding over the greatest crisis in the history of the Church, and his response was complicated by the fact that the German princes who were converting to Lutheranism were also the political subjects he needed for his other wars, and could not simply crush without unravelling the entire structure of Holy Roman Empire politics. The second great struggle was with France. The French king Francis III was encircled by Habsburg territories and understandably alarmed about it, and the two monarchs fought a series of wars across the Italian peninsula that constituted one of the most destructive series of conflicts in 16th century Europe. The low point was the sack of Rome in 1527, when Charles's German and Spanish troops, who had not been paid and were essentially out of control, broke into the Eternal City and committed a rampage of violence and plunder against the capital of Christendom that traumatized European civilization, Pope Clement VII spent months as a prisoner in the Castel Sant'Angelo. The humanist culture of the Renaissance papacy never fully recovered its confidence. Charles, who was technically a devout Catholic, had to do a very great deal of apologizing for this, while privately acknowledging that it had substantially improved his negotiating position with the Pope. He also fought the Ottoman Empire, whose Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was at the peak of his power, and was pressing into Central Europe, reaching the walls of Vienna in 1529. Charles organized the defense of Vienna and the broader struggle against Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean, including personally leading an expedition against Tunis in 1535 that recaptured the city from an Ottoman-aligned pirate. This was genuinely impressive, if ultimately inconclusive. The Americas were expanding throughout Charles's reign. The conquests of Mexico and Peru happened under his rule. The silver of Potosi began to flow into Spanish coffers. Charles used this wealth to fund his endless wars, which is to say he borrowed heavily against future silver revenues and was perpetually in debt to the Genoese and Augsburg bankers who financed his campaigns. The relationship between American silver and European debt created cycles of boom and crisis that would define the Spanish fiscal system for a century. The debates about the morality of the American conquests reached their peak during Charles's reign. The philosopher-theologian Francisco de Vitoria at the University of Salamanca challenged the legal basis for Spanish dominion over the Americas, with arguments of remarkable sophistication, essentially founding the modern field of international law in the process. Bartolomé de las Casas presented his devastating account of the destruction of the indigenous peoples, the Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, to the court and helped secure the passage of the new laws of 1542. Charles was genuinely troubled by the moral dimensions of the conquest in a way that is difficult to reconcile with his simultaneous use of its proceeds, which perhaps reflects less hypocrisy than the genuinely difficult problem of governing an empire whose foundations were laid before you inherited it. In 1556, Charles did something extraordinary. He abdicated. He divided his empire between his son Philip, who received Spain, the Netherlands, and the American colonies, and his brother Ferdinand, who received Austria and the Holy Roman Empire title. Then he retired to a monastery at Yuste in Extremadura, where he lived for 2 more years among monks, tinkering with clocks, eating too much, and apparently discussing theology. He died in 1558. The abdication of Charles V is one of the most remarkable acts in political history. Here was the most powerful man in the world voluntarily giving it all up, not because he was forced to, but because he was exhausted, because he felt he had failed in his 2 great purposes of reuniting Christendom and defeating the Ottomans, because he was sick and tired and possibly genuinely wanted peace. Whatever the precise motivations, the act itself tells you something important about the man, and something important about the limits of personal power, even at the scale of an empire. His son Philip II inherited the core of the Spanish Empire. Austria and Germany went to the other branch of the Habsburg family. The empire remained tied together through diplomacy and marriage, but the unified vision of a single Christian emperor ruling all of Europe died with Charles's abdication and was buried for good when the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 formally recognized the right of German princes to determine the religion of their territories, enshrining the permanent division of Christian Europe between Catholics and Protestants. The Spanish Golden Age, Cervantes, Velázquez, and the soul of an empire. There is a paradox at the heart of what historians call the Spanish Golden Age, the Siglo de Oro, the century of gold that stretched roughly from 1500 to 1650. This was the period when Spanish military power was at its greatest, when Spanish silver was flooding into European markets, when Spanish dominion extended across 3 continents. It was also the period that produced some of the finest literature, painting, and architecture in human history. And the paradox is this: much of the greatest art of the Golden Age is about failure, decline, delusion, and the gap between appearance and reality. Miguel de Cervantes, who published the first part of Don Quixote in 1605, was the defining figure of this tradition. Cervantes had lived through the full arc of Spanish imperial ambition. He had fought at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, the great naval battle against the Ottoman Empire at which his left hand was permanently crippled and which he later described as the greatest day he had ever known. He had spent 5 years as a slave in Algiers after being captured by Barbary pirates. He had worked for years as a government commissary, attempting to collect grain from reluctant Andalusian towns to supply the Armada, a job at which he failed and for which he was briefly imprisoned. By the time he wrote Don Quixote, he was an old man who had seen the full glory and the full disappointment of Spanish imperial power. Don Quixote is ostensibly a comic novel about a middle-aged gentleman from La Mancha who has read too many chivalric romances and gone mad, wandering the roads of Spain convinced that he is a knight-errant, fighting windmills he mistakes for giants, and dragging his long-suffering and earthly peasant squire Sancho Panza along with him. It is also one of the most sophisticated explorations of the nature of reality, the value of idealism, the relationship between illusion and truth, and the human capacity for self-deception that has ever been written. Every generation reads it differently, and every generation finds something new in it. What makes it most specifically a product of its time and place is the character of Don Quixote himself. He is a man out of time, pursuing values from an age that has passed, refusing to accept a reality that contradicts his internal vision, and possessing, beneath his delusion, a genuine nobility that the sane and practical characters around him lack. It is impossible not to read this as a meditation on Spain itself, a civilization that had been shaped by centuries of crusading idealism, that had built its identity on the concepts of honour, faith, and heroism, and that was now confronting the gap between those ideals and the rather more complicated reality of running a global empire. Cervantes loved Spain, and was clear-eyed about it simultaneously. The novel is both an act of love and an act of criticism. The theatre of the Golden Age produced playwrights of enormous vitality. Lope de Vega, who claimed to have written over 1,000 plays, though modern scholars count closer to 400 surviving ones, was a figure of extraordinary prolific energy. His life was as theatrical as his work, involving 2 scandalous love affairs that earned him exile from Madrid, military service with the Armada, multiple marriages and many more romantic entanglements, and a final turn toward religious devotion that produced some of his finest devotional poetry. He invented a form of popular theatre that fused comedy, tragedy, song, and spectacle into something entirely new, and his plays were performed in the open-air chorales, the Madrid theatre courtyards, before audiences of every class. Pedro Calderón de la Barca, who followed Lope and brought the Golden Age theatre to its philosophical peak, wrote plays that engage with questions of honour, free will, illusion, and religious faith with a philosophical depth unusual in drama of any period. His most famous work, La vida es sueño, Life is a Dream, presents a prince who has been imprisoned since birth to prevent a prophecy of tyranny from being fulfilled, is briefly released to be tested, behaves badly, is returned to prison and told his experience was a dream, and emerges determined to behave nobly, regardless of whether his experience of the world is real or illusory. It is a play about how to act rightly in a world where certainty is impossible. The Spanish Empire in the 17th century was full of certainty. Its greatest artists were asking whether that certainty was justified. In painting, the Golden Age produced 2 figures who stand among the greatest artists in European history. El Greco, born Domenikos Theotokopoulos in Crete, arrived in Toledo in the 1570s and developed a style of elongated, luminous, ecstatic religiosity that is like nothing else in Western art. His figures stretch toward heaven with their eyes rolled upward in fervour. His colours are cold and electric. His landscapes are the product of a fevered spiritual imagination rather than any observed reality. He is simultaneously a painter of intense Christian devotion and an artist who seems to be questioning the nature of vision itself. Diego Velázquez, court painter to Philip IV and one of the greatest technical masters in the history of European painting, presents a more worldly surface but an equally mysterious depth. Las Meninas, painted in 1656, is an endlessly analysed painting of remarkable self-consciousness, depicting Velázquez himself painting what appears to be a portrait of the king and queen, who are visible only as reflections in a mirror at the back of the room, while in the foreground stand the young Infanta Margarita and her attendants. It is a painting about the act of painting, about the relationship between artist, subject and observer, about who has power and who represents it, about what is real and what is reflected image. It is one of the most discussed paintings in the world, and it rewards the discussion. The architecture of the Golden Age presents a slightly different picture. The monastery palace of El Escorial, built for Philip II between 1563 and 1584 northwest of Madrid, is the architectural expression of the Spanish Empire at its most powerful and most austere. It is simultaneously a royal residence, a monastery, a church, a library, and a royal mausoleum. built in a style of severe geometric clarity that Philip imposed over the more ornate preferences of his architects. It is enormous, cold, and magnificent. It says, power does not need decoration. It says order is beauty. It says the king serves God and God alone requires his magnificence. Philip II spent enormous amounts of time at El Escorial, governing his global empire from small, simply furnished rooms, while one of the greatest libraries in Europe accumulated in the adjoining rooms. The contrast between the scale of the building and the modesty of the royal quarters tells you something essential about Philip's character and about the Spanish imperial ideology. The Golden Age also produced a flowering of mystical literature. St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross wrote poetry and prose of extraordinary spiritual intensity in the second half of the 16th century, exploring the experience of divine love with a precision and a beauty that makes their work as relevant today as it was then. Teresa reformed the Carmelite order, founded 17 new convents, walked hundreds of miles across Spain in wooden sandals, and wrote several major works of spirituality, while dealing with the Inquisition's suspicion of her mystical experiences and navigating the politics of the Spanish Church. She was the kind of person who makes you wonder what you have been doing with your life. The Golden Age is paradoxical because it coincides exactly with the period of Spain's greatest power and the beginning of its decline. The writers and painters of the Siglo de Oro were creating works of lasting genius at precisely the moment when the silver was running out. The wars were going badly, the plague was spreading, and the certainties that had sustained Spanish imperial ideology were being quietly eroded. The Golden Age was Spain's most sustained act of artistic self-examination, and the conclusions its artists reached were often uncomfortable. They built something permanent in human culture during a moment when everything around them was beginning to fall apart. Philip II, the Des King and the limits of power. Philip II of Spain may have been the hardest working monarch in the history of the world. He governed his empire through paper, reading every document personally, annotating every report in his careful handwriting, insisting on knowing everything before making any decision. He worked at his desk from early morning until late at night. He governed Spain, the Netherlands, Portugal, Milan, Naples, Sicily, and an American empire of several million square kilometers through paperwork. He moved so slowly and so cautiously that his officials coined the phrase, "If death came from Spain, we would all live forever." He did not find this funny. He governed by instinct for personal control and profound theological conviction, and the results were both impressive and disastrous. Philip II inherited Spain from Charles V in 1556, and from the beginning he was a very different ruler from his father. Charles had been an itinerant emperor, constantly moving across Europe. Philip was essentially sedentary, spending most of his reign in or near Madrid, governing from El Escorial, communicating with his empire through letters and dispatches. This had practical advantages in terms of administrative control and practical disadvantages in terms of response speed. In an age before telecommunications, governing a global empire from a single fixed point meant that crises had often resolved themselves, one way or another, before the king's instructions arrived. Philip's reign opened with a significant success. In 1571, the Holy League of Spain, Venice, and the Papacy, commanded by Philip's illegitimate half-brother Don John of Austria, defeated the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Lepanto in the Gulf of Corinth. It was the largest naval battle in the Mediterranean since antiquity, involving over 400 ships and perhaps 150,000 men. The Ottoman fleet was essentially destroyed, and the myth of Ottoman naval invincibility was shattered. Lepanto was celebrated across Catholic Europe as a defining victory for Christian civilization, and it genuinely did mark the end of Ottoman expansion in the Western Mediterranean. Cervantes, who fought there and lost his hand, remembered it as the greatest day of his life. Philip celebrated it as a vindication of his policy and his faith. But Lepanto was followed almost immediately by a serious defeat in the Netherlands, which was to become the great bleeding wound of Philip's reign. The Netherlands, the 17 provinces that are now Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, were the most economically developed territory in the Habsburg inheritance. Their cities, Antwerp above all, were the financial and commercial centre of northern Europe. They were also, by the 1560s, increasingly Calvinist in their religious composition, deeply resentful of what they saw as Spanish domination, and outraged by Philip's attempts to impose religious conformity. When Philip sent the Duke of Alba to suppress a revolt in 1567 with an army of Spanish veterans, the result was a reign of terror that killed thousands, drove hundreds of thousands into exile, and converted what had been a manageable political problem into an existential crisis. The Dutch Revolt, which became the 80 Years' War, lasted from 1568 to 1648. It consumed Spanish treasure and Spanish soldiers at a rate that steadily bankrupted the empire. The Spanish declared bankruptcy 3 times during Philip's reign alone, in 1557, 1575 and 1596, and each time the consequences rippled through the European financial system. The bankers of Genoa and Augsburg who had lent to the Spanish crown found themselves in crisis. The flow of silver from the Americas was never quite enough to cover the cost of maintaining armies in the Netherlands, paying for the Armada, funding the wars in Italy, and servicing the accumulated debt of 4 decades of imperial overstretch. The Spanish Armada is Philip II's most famous disaster, and in many ways his most revealing one. By 1588, relations with England had deteriorated beyond repair. England under Elizabeth the Fern was supporting the Dutch rebels, allowing English privateers like Francis Drake to raid Spanish shipping and ports and harbouring Protestant exiles. Philip planned a massive naval expedition to invade England, seize the throne for Catholicism, and cut off English support for the Dutch. The armada that sailed in May 1588 consisted of 130 ships and about 30,000 men. What actually happened tells you a great deal about the gap between Philip's ambitions and the realities his empire confronted. The plan required the armada to rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands and ferry it across the Channel, but the armada found it impossible to shelter in the shallow harbours of the Flemish coast, where Parma's army was waiting. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham with Francis Drake as vice-admiral, was smaller but faster and more manoeuvrable, and used fireships at gravlines to scatter the armada from its anchorage. A fierce battle in the Channel inflicted significant damage. Then the armada, unable to return home through the Channel, was forced to attempt the long route around Scotland and Ireland in autumn storms that wrecked dozens of ships on the rocks of the Irish coast. Of the 130 ships that sailed, perhaps 67 returned. Perhaps 20,000 men died. Philip received the news of the armada's disaster with apparent calm, allegedly saying that he had sent his ships to fight against men, not against the wind and the waves. He refused to abandon the strategic objective and organised new armadas in 1596 and 1597, both of which were also dispersed by storms. England remained Protestant. The Dutch remained in rebellion. The silver kept coming, but not quite fast enough. In 1580, Philip had added the Kingdom of Portugal and its global empire to his collection when the Portuguese throne fell vacant and he was able to press his claim. This made Spain, briefly and nominally, the greatest maritime empire in the world, with possessions extending from Brazil to Angola to Goa to Macau to the Philippines. The union did not produce the synergies it promised because Philip essentially governed Portugal as a separate kingdom, and because the Portuguese resented Spanish domination intensely, eventually revolting in 1640 and re-establishing their independence. Philip II died in 1598, having spent 42 years on the throne, working himself and his empire toward exhaustion. He had held the empire together through sheer force of administrative will, but he had left it weaker than he found it. The Netherlands was still in revolt. The debt was crushing. The silver from the Americas, though still flowing, was being matched by the increasing cost of maintaining an empire that was overextended in every direction. His son Philip III would inherit a system under genuine stress, and the 17th century would make that stress progressively worse. The Atlantic slave trade and the human cost of empire. The Spanish Empire's global reach rested on a foundation of human suffering so vast that it requires its own chapter, and even so cannot be fully described or comprehended within any single chapter's length. The enslavement of African people and their transportation to the Americas was not invented by Spain. It existed before the Spanish Empire, and it was practiced by every European colonial power that followed. But Spain was among the earliest and most systematic practitioners, and the institution of slavery in the Americas took the forms it did partly because of the structures that Spain put in place in the early 16th century. The first enslaved Africans arrived in the Caribbean shortly after Columbus's initial voyages. As the indigenous Taino population collapsed from disease and overwork, the Spanish colonies faced an acute labour shortage. The enslaved Africans, who were themselves survivors of the diseases of the Old World, and therefore had significantly more resistance to them than the indigenous Americans, were introduced as a replacement labour force. The logic was cold and economical. It had nothing to do with racial ideology in the modern sense, though racial ideology would develop to justify it. It had to do with who could survive the work and who could be legally compelled to perform it. The Spanish crown authorized the asiento system, a contract granting individuals or companies the right to import enslaved Africans to specific Spanish-American colonies. These contracts were initially held by Portuguese traders who had more established connections to the African slave trade, and later by Dutch, English, and French merchants as the empire's trading patterns shifted. The scale of the trade grew steadily throughout the colonial period. By the time the transatlantic slave trade ended in the 19th century, an estimated 12.5 million Africans had been forcibly transported to the Americas. Of these, perhaps 1 million died during the Middle Passage crossing alone, in conditions of deliberate overcrowding, disease, and brutality that defy description without losing their humanity, which is precisely the trap the perpetrators intended to set. The enslaved people who survived the crossing were put to work in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and Brazil, in the silver mines of Mexico and Peru, in the households of colonial elites, in the urban economies of the colonial cities, and in the agricultural systems that fed the colonial population. Their labour was the bedrock on which colonial wealth rested. The Spanish colonial economy would not have functioned without it. The sugar of Cuba and Puerto Rico, which Spain retained long after losing the mainland Americas, was produced entirely through enslaved labour until the late 19th century. The encomienda system, the Spanish institution that distributed indigenous people as a labour force to colonial landholders, was technically distinct from slavery but functionally similar in many respects. The holder of an encomienda had the right to the labour of the indigenous people assigned to them, and was supposed to provide them with Christian instruction and protection in return. In practice, the labour demands were frequently lethal. Indigenous people were worked to death in mines, in agricultural operations, and in construction projects. The Mita system in Peru, which drafted indigenous people for periods of compulsory labour in the Potosi mines, was particularly deadly. The Potosi mines are estimated to have killed 8 million people over the colonial period, a number that has been used so often it risks becoming abstract, but which represents 8 million individual human beings who went down into the darkness and did not come back. The intellectual and moral debate about these practices was real and important and ultimately insufficient to stop them. Bartolomé de las Casas, who had been an encomendero himself before his conversion to the cause of indigenous rights, became the most powerful advocate for the humanity and rights of the indigenous peoples in the Spanish Empire. His Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, written in 1542 and published in 1552, is one of the most important political documents of the colonial era, a devastating account of the atrocities committed by Spanish colonizers presented to the emperor with explicit moral urgency. Las Casas lived to 92, spending most of those years arguing, writing, lobbying, and occasionally despairing, and his work contributed directly to legislative reforms. But here is the complication in the Las Casas story that is often overlooked. In his early advocacy for indigenous rights, he suggested that the labour demands currently being placed on indigenous people could be transferred to African enslaved people, who he believed would be better able to withstand the conditions. He later repudiated this suggestion and expressed his regret for it, but for generations the suggestion was cited as moral cover for the African slave trade. His biography is a microcosm of the impossibilities of being a moral actor within an immoral system. The Spanish Inquisition in the Americas, though generally less severe than in Spain, added another layer of coercive force to the colonial order. It pursued crypto-Jews who had emigrated to the Americas, sometimes Protestants, occasionally indigenous people accused of maintaining their traditional religious practices under a veneer of Christianity. The fear it generated was real even when its actual prosecutions were relatively infrequent. The biological catastrophe of the conquest is difficult to overstate. The population of the Americas in 1492 is genuinely uncertain, with estimates ranging from 40 million to over 100 million. By 1600, whatever the pre-contact population had been, it had been reduced by somewhere between 50 and 90% in most regions. Some areas were completely depopulated. Mexico, which may have had 20 to 25 million inhabitants in 1519 when Cortés arrived, had perhaps 1 million by 1620. The recovery took centuries. The demographic consequences shaped everything that followed: the economic structure of the colonies, the social systems that developed, the cultural mixing that occurred as indigenous survivors, European settlers, and enslaved Africans were thrown together in new configurations. All of this is the human cost of empire. The gold and silver that funded the Habsburgs' wars came from the deaths of indigenous miners. The sugar that sweetened European coffee came from the lives of enslaved Africans. The commercial networks that connected the world were built on systematic exploitation and violence. The Spanish Empire was not unique in this among European colonial powers. The Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French were all doing comparable things. But Spain was first, and the patterns it established of racial hierarchy, forced labour, extraction of resources with no regard for the human cost, were templates that the others largely followed. It is not possible to tell the story of the Spanish Empire honestly without dwelling on this. The cathedrals were built with indigenous labour. The silver roads were paved with bones. The wealth that funded the golden age of Cervantes and Velázquez came from the mines of Potosi. These things are not separate, they are the same story. The 17th century cracks in the Colossus. The 17th century opened with Spain still the dominant power in Europe, still the master of an enormous American empire, still capable of fielding armies that other powers feared and respected. It closed with Spain a secondary power, its American empire intact but its European prestige shattered, its economy hollowed out, its population declining, and the initiative in European affairs firmly in the hands of France. The decline was not sudden. It was gradual, structural, and deeply connected to the choices that had been made in the previous century. The first great problem was financial. The Spanish monarchy had borrowed massively against future silver revenues to fund the wars of Charles V and Philip II. By the early 17th century, the debt service alone consumed a substantial portion of the crown's income. The silver from the Americas was still flowing, but the mines of Potosi were producing less as the richest seams were exhausted, and the costs of extraction from deeper shafts increased. The military cost of maintaining the empire, particularly in the Netherlands where the 80 Years' War ground on, was enormous. Philip III, who reigned from 1598 to 1621, and Philip Thole, who reigned from 1621 to 1665, both inherited these structural problems and neither had the capacity to solve them. Philip III delegated governance to favourites, particularly the Duke of Lerma, who was less interested in imperial management than in personal enrichment. One of the Duke of Lerma's most significant decisions was the expulsion of the Moriscos, the descendants of Muslim converts to Christianity, between 1609 and 1614. Perhaps 300,000 people were expelled, most of them from the Kingdom of Valencia, where they had constituted a significant portion of the agricultural labour force. The economic disruption was considerable, particularly in Valencia, where agriculture took decades to recover. The Moriscos, like the Jews a century before, had been a productive element of Spanish society. Their removal made the empire less, not more, of what it needed to be. The Dutch Republic, which formally declared independence in 1648 through the Treaty of Westphalia, had grown during its 80 years of war with Spain into one of the most dynamic commercial and financial powers in the world. The Amsterdam Bourse was the centre of European finance. The Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company were taking Spanish and Portuguese trading routes and colonial positions all over the world. The Dutch seized the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia from Portugal. They established a trading post at the Cape of Good Hope. They colonized parts of Brazil for a period. They were in Hudson Bay, in Ceylon, in Taiwan. They were everywhere the Spanish and Portuguese had been, and they were doing it with greater commercial efficiency and at lower cost. England under the Stuarts was a less active commercial rival, but an increasingly assertive naval power. The English had been raiding Spanish shipping in the Caribbean for decades, and their occupation of Jamaica in 1655 gave them a permanent Caribbean base from which to challenge the Spanish monopoly on trade with the Americas. The contraband trade was enormous, with British, Dutch and French merchants supplying the Spanish-American colonies with goods that could not be obtained legally through the restrictive, official Spanish trade system. The 30 Years' War, which devastated Central Europe from 1618 to 1648, is sometimes described as a religious war between Protestants and Catholics, and sometimes as a struggle for European hegemony between the Habsburgs and their rivals. It was both. Spain supported the Austrian Habsburgs and contributed troops and money to their campaigns against Protestant princes, Swedish armies, and eventually a France under Cardinal Richelieu that allied with Protestant powers against the Habsburgs for straightforwardly strategic reasons. The 30 Years' War killed perhaps a third of the population of some German territories through battle, famine, and disease. It was the most destructive European conflict before the 20th century, and Spain paid for its involvement with borrowed money and deteriorating military capacity. The year 1640 was particularly catastrophic. Portugal revolted and re-established its independence under the Braganza dynasty. Catalonia revolted in what became known as the Reapers' War, the war of its peasantry against the billeting of Castilian troops. The revolt in Catalonia was eventually suppressed, but Portugal's independence was secured and Spain lost its brief possession of a second global empire. Also in 1640, conspiracy in Andalusia suggested the depth of discontent even in the core Castilian territories. Domestically, the 17th century was a period of severe demographic pressure. Plague struck repeatedly, most devastatingly in the 1647 to 1652 epidemic that killed perhaps 500,000 people in Spain itself, roughly 15% of the population. Agriculture was disrupted, towns depopulated. The loss of population compounded the labour shortages that already afflicted the economy. Yet even in this century of decline, the cultural and intellectual life of Spain maintained extraordinary vitality. Velázquez painted his greatest works under Philip IV. Calderón wrote his philosophical masterpieces. The Spanish picaresque novel, a literary form invented in Spain in the previous century, with the anonymous Lazarillo de Tormes, and developed by Francisco de Quevedo and others, continued to explore the moral contradictions of a society simultaneously obsessed with honour and riddled with corruption. The mystical tradition continued in the convents and monasteries. The Baroque churches that were built across Spain and its empire in this century, with their extravagant gilded altarpieces and their dramatic sculptural programs, represent a kind of compensatory magnificence, as if the physical expression of divine grandeur could substitute for the political power that was slipping away. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30 Years' War and formally recognised the independence of the Dutch Republic. Spain accepted what had been militarily evident for decades. The Netherlands was lost. The Spanish Habsburgs retained the Spanish Netherlands, the southern provinces that are now Belgium, but the northern provinces that formed the Dutch Republic would never return to Spanish sovereignty. The great project of maintaining a Catholic Habsburg Northern Europe had failed. By the end of the century, France under Louis XIV had replaced Spain as the dominant power in Europe. The Sun King's armies had fought several wars against Spain and had taken significant territories in the Spanish Netherlands. The prestige and cultural leadership of Europe had passed from Madrid to Paris. Spain was not finished as a power, but its role had fundamentally changed from dominant hegemon to important but secondary actor. The question of what came next would be answered in the most dramatic way possible by the extinction of its ruling dynasty, the War of Spanish Succession and the Bourbon takeover. In November 1700, Charles II of Spain died. He had been sick, strange, and incapable for most of his reign, the product of generations of Habsburg inbreeding that had progressively concentrated recessive genetic disorders into his hapless person. He could barely chew his food. He walked late and had significant cognitive difficulties. He had been married twice and produced no children. The last Habsburg king of Spain was, in the most literal sense, a dead end. And because he left no heir, his death triggered one of the largest and most destructive wars of the 18th century. The problem was that virtually every major European dynasty had some dynastic claim to the Spanish throne through the complex intermarriage patterns of the previous century and a half. The two most serious claimants were Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France through his mother, who was a daughter of Philip of Spain, and Archduke Charles of Austria, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold III, who pressed the Austrian Habsburg claim. The prospect of Spain's vast empire being inherited by either a French prince or an Austrian prince terrified the other European powers. If France absorbed Spain's empire, Louis XIV would control a hegemony stretching from the Rhine to Peru. If Austria inherited, the Habsburg Empire would be reconstituted with even greater power. Charles II's will, which he altered several times in his last years under competing pressures, finally left everything to Philip of Anjou on condition that the crowns of France and Spain would remain forever separate. Louis XIV accepted on behalf of his grandson, who became Philip V of Spain, and immediately indicated through his behaviour that the condition about keeping the crown separate was somewhat flexible in his interpretation. The other European powers formed the Grand Alliance of England, the Dutch Republic and Austria to contest this outcome, and in 1701 the War of the Spanish Succession began. The war lasted 13 years and was fought in the Spanish Netherlands, Italy, the Iberian Peninsula itself, and even in the Americas. It produced some of the most famous battles in British military history, including the Duke of Marlborough's victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, and Malplaquet, which broke the myth of French military invincibility in the same way that the Battle of Lepanto had broken the Ottoman myth a century and a half earlier. In Spain itself, the war became a civil war of a kind, with Castile generally supporting Philip and Catalonia, Aragon and Valencia supporting the Austrian claimant. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, a set of complex negotiations that redistributed European power considerably. Philip V kept Spain and its American empire, but confirmed the permanent separation of the French and Spanish crowns. Spain ceded the Spanish Netherlands, now Belgium, to Austria, along with Sardinia, Milan and Naples. Britain gained Gibraltar, which it had captured in 1704 and has held ever since, plus the island of Minorca and crucially the Asiento, the contract to supply enslaved people to the Spanish Americas. It was a significant commercial prize that gave Britain a wedge into the Spanish colonial trade system it would use to considerable advantage. The defeat of Catalonia and the other Aragonese territories had internal consequences of great lasting importance. Philip V, in his Nueva Planta decrees of 1707 to 1716, abolished the separate institutions, laws and privileges of Aragon, Valencia, Catalonia and Majorca, imposing Castilian administrative uniformity on territories that had previously maintained their distinctive constitutional frameworks. Catalonia lost its parliament, its law code, and the official status of the Catalan language. This centralisation, borrowing heavily from French Bourbon models, was the beginning of a process that created a more unified Spanish state, but it did so in ways that planted deep resentments that are still flowering in Spanish politics 300 years later. The Catalan independence movement of the 21st century has its roots, at least in part, in the memory of 1713. The Bourbon monarchy brought France into the Spanish imperial story in multiple ways. French administrative models were adopted. French cultural influence became dominant at the Spanish court. French-trained officials replaced many of the old aristocratic families in positions of power. The relationship between Spain and France, so long adversarial, became close to the point of subordination under the Family Compact, the series of alliances between the Bourbon courts of Paris and Madrid that defined much of 18th century European diplomacy. For the Americas, the change of dynasty was significant but not transformative in the short term. The Bourbons brought a more reformist, Enlightenment-influenced approach to colonial governance that would produce the Bourbon reforms of the later 18th century, attempting to make the colonial administration more efficient and more profitable for the crown. These reforms had the unintended consequence of alienating the Criollo elites of Spanish America, who had been comfortably running their own affairs under the relatively relaxed oversight of the later Habsburgs, and whose resentment of the new centralization and the new taxes would eventually fuel the independence movements of the early 19th century. But all of that was still in the future. In the early 18th century, Spain under the new Bourbon dynasty was reorganizing itself, recovering somewhat from the exhaustions of the previous century, and adapting to a changed position in the European order. It was no longer the dominant power, but it was still an empire of enormous reach, and it was about to experience a century of relative prosperity and reforming optimism before the next great catastrophe arrived in the form of a short French general with imperial ambitions of his own, Bourbon Spain and the twilight of empire. The 18th century was, by the standards of what had come before and what would come after, a relatively stable and even somewhat prosperous period for Spain. The Bourbon dynasty brought with it ideas from the French Enlightenment about rational governance, economic reform, and the role of the state in managing and developing the resources of its territories. The reigns of Philip V, Ferdinand VI, and particularly Charles III, who ruled from 1759 to 1788, and is remembered as the best king Spain ever had by those who find benevolent despotism appealing, saw significant administrative, economic, and cultural improvements. Charles III was a genuine reformer in the Enlightenment tradition. He improved roads and communications. He promoted industry and trade. He cleaned up Madrid, which had previously been a city of such spectacular squalor that foreign visitors were scandalized, and gave it proper sewers, street lighting, and pavements. He established the Botanical Garden and the Prado Museum, though the Prado did not open to the public until after his reign. He supported the arts and sciences. He also expelled the Jesuits from Spain and all its territories in 1767, a decision made partly on rational Enlightenment grounds about the order's excessive political influence, and partly because he found their power in the American missions threatening to royal authority. The expulsion of the Jesuits from the Americas disrupted the mission system significantly, and removed one of the few institutional forces that had consistently stood between indigenous peoples and colonial exploitation. The Bourbon reforms in the Americas were driven by a combination of genuine desire to improve governance and a clear-eyed calculation that the colonies were not generating as much revenue for the crown as they should be. The reforms created new viceroyalties, the Viceroyalty of New Granada in 1717, and the Viceroyalty of the River Plate in 1776, to improve administration of territories that had become too large for the existing two viceroyalties to manage effectively. Free trade policies, at least within the empire, replaced the old system by which all colonial trade had to flow through specific Spanish ports, which had been economically constricting and had driven enormous amounts of trade into contraband. The reforms also brought new peninsula-born officials into colonial positions, displacing the Criollo elites who had grown accustomed to running things informally in the colonies. This was deeply resented. The Criollos, the American-born Spaniards who formed the colonial upper class, found themselves simultaneously more prosperous from the economic liberalization of the trade system and more politically subordinate as their access to official positions was restricted. They were reading Enlightenment philosophy, discussing Rousseau and Voltaire and Montesquieu, absorbing ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty, and looking at the American Revolution of 1776 and thinking interesting thoughts. The American Revolution itself had a profound impact on Spain, though not in the way you might initially expect. Spain formally entered the war on the American side against Britain in 1779, partly for straightforward strategic reasons. Britain was Spain's great commercial rival, and a weakened Britain was in Spain's interest. The war allowed Spain to recover Florida and Minorca from British control, modest gains, but the ideological implications of supporting a colonial independence movement against a European metropolis were not entirely comfortable for a country that had its own colonies. It was a lesson that would be learned more painfully in the decades to come. Culturally, the 18th century produced Francisco Goya, arguably the most extraordinary artist Spain has ever given the world, and one of the most important artists in the history of Western painting. Goya began his career as a court painter, producing charming tapestry cartoons and affable portraits of the Spanish aristocracy. He ended it producing the Black Paintings, a series of dark, nightmarish images that he painted directly on the walls of his house, including Saturn devouring his son, a terrifying image of the god of time eating one of his children with a ferocity that seems to come from somewhere beyond rational control. In between, he produced the Disasters of War series of prints, documenting the Peninsular War against Napoleon with a brutality and moral complexity unprecedented in the history of war art. Goya's trajectory tells the story of Spain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He began in the confident Enlightenment world of Charles the Thoro's court, moved through the disillusionment of Charles IV's reign, was traumatized by the Napoleonic invasion, and ended in the dark. He was deaf from 1792 following a serious illness, and his growing isolation perhaps deepened the inward turn his art took. But it also reflected what was happening in Spain itself, a civilization that had been shaken by events too large and too fast for the old frameworks to absorb. The reign of Charles IV, who came to the throne in 1788, saw Spain stumble badly. The French Revolution alarmed the Spanish monarchy and triggered a reactionary response, closing the borders to French ideas and tightening censorship, which was less than fully effective but created an atmosphere of intellectual fear. The execution of Louis XVI brought Spain into war with revolutionary France in 1793, a war that went badly. The subsequent Peace of Basel in 1795 was humiliating and left Spain in the position of French client rather than French ally. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, in which the combined Franco-Spanish fleet was destroyed by Nelson, ended Spain's naval power permanently and left its American empire exposed and dependent on whatever goodwill the dominant naval power, Britain, chose to extend. The real power behind the Spanish throne during Charles III's reign was not the king but his wife's favourite, Manuel de Godoy, a figure of remarkable political longevity who managed Spain's relationship with revolutionary France with a combination of cynicism, adaptability, and occasional genuine statesmanship, but who was deeply hated by the Spanish public, which suspected him of being the Queen's lover, which he probably was. When Napoleon decided that Spain was too valuable to remain merely a French client state, Godoy's balancing act became impossible. What followed would be among the most traumatic episodes in Spanish history: Napoleon, the Peninsular War, and the empire's collapse. Napoleon Bonaparte's relationship with Spain, is one of the more remarkable examples of strategic overreach in modern history, which is saying something given Napoleon's career. Having made Spain a client state and then finding the client insufficiently compliant, he decided in 1808 to simply replace the Spanish monarchy with his own family. He lured the Spanish royal family into a meeting at Bayonne in France, effectively kidnapped both Charles V and his son Ferdinand, who had just deposed him in a coup, forced both of them to renounce their claims to the Spanish throne, and installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain. He then discovered that the Spanish people were not going to accept this. What followed was called the Guerra de la Independencia in Spain, the Peninsular War in British military history, and has been described by Napoleon himself, reflecting later in exile as the Spanish ulcer that drained the strength of his empire. It lasted from 1808 to 1814 and was characterized by a level of popular violence and civilian participation in warfare that was genuinely new in European experience. The Spanish army was quickly defeated in conventional engagements, but the Spanish people, particularly in the countryside and in the smaller towns, did not behave like a defeated population. They organized irregular resistance, the guerrillas, a word that English borrowed from Spanish in this period along with the concept it described. These guerrilla bands, operating from mountains and forests, cutting French supply lines, ambushing columns, assassinating collaborators, and generally making it impossible for the French to pacify any territory they occupied, tied down enormous numbers of French troops in an endless, exhausting security operation. Goya documented this war in his Disasters of War prints with images of extraordinary moral complexity, showing atrocities committed by both sides, French troops executing Spanish civilians and Spanish guerrillas torturing French prisoners, without any glorification or simple patriotic framing. The most famous image from this war, his painting the 3rd of May, 1808, shows the execution of Spanish civilians by French troops the morning after an uprising in Madrid. The Spanish figures standing in the light facing the anonymous mechanical firing squad with a mixture of terror and defiance. It is one of the most powerful anti-war images in the history of painting, and it is specifically Spanish in its location of heroism, in anonymous ordinary people rather than in noble military commanders. The British expedition under Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal in 1808 and fought the French army across the Iberian Peninsula for 6 years in a campaign of remarkable strategic complexity. Wellington was not a romantic figure. He was methodical, caustic, and clear-eyed about his soldiers and his enemies in ways that some people found refreshing and others found deeply off-putting. He once said that his army was composed of the scum of the earth who had enlisted for drink, which rather overstated the case but captured his lack of sentimentality about military glory. The combination of Wellington's army, the Spanish guerrillas, the Portuguese military, and the simple fact that Napoleonic France was simultaneously fighting Russia, Prussia, Austria, and everyone else in Europe meant that the peninsula became a progressive drain on French military capacity. By 1814, Joseph Bonaparte had been expelled, Ferdinand VII had been restored to the Spanish throne, and the Peninsular War was over. But here is the crucial thing about the Peninsular War in the context of the Spanish Empire. While the metropolis was consumed by the Napoleonic conflict, the colonies were on their own. The Spanish-American Empire had been built on the assumption of a functioning monarchy in Spain that could mediate disputes, provide military support, and maintain the legitimacy of colonial governance. The crisis of 1808 removed that assumption entirely. Ferdinand VII was in French captivity. Joseph Bonaparte, whom the Spanish called Pepe Botella, Joey Bottles, a reference to his alleged fondness for drink, was on the throne in Madrid. The colonial elites faced a genuine question. Who were they supposed to be loyal to? The question sounds constitutional, but it was actually existential. Different colonies answered it differently in the short term, but the experience of governing themselves, of realizing that they could govern themselves, of articulating in councils and juntas the political ideas that the Enlightenment had given them, was irreversible. The period from 1808 to 1814 did not immediately produce independence movements everywhere, but it produced the conditions for them, the experience of self-government, the vocabulary of popular sovereignty, and the realization that the connection to Madrid was contingent rather than natural. When Ferdinand VII was restored to the throne in 1814, he might have played a more conciliatory hand and managed a gradual negotiated transition to a looser imperial structure that might have preserved some connection between Spain and the Americas. Instead, he was a reactionary of remarkable stubbornness who abolished the liberal constitution that had been drafted in Cadiz in 1812 by the resistance government during the French occupation and reimposed absolute monarchy. His response to the independence movements that were already developing in the Americas was to try to suppress them militarily, which he had neither the resources nor the strategic capacity to do effectively. The Spanish Empire's collapse in the Americas was already underway before the Peninsular War was over. Napoleon had inadvertently broken the bond between Spain and its empire more thoroughly than any external enemy could have done. The rest would be history in both senses of the phrase. The loss of the Americas. Independence movements. The independence of Spanish America was not a single event. It was a process that unfolded over roughly 15 years, from the initial stirrings after 1808 to the final military conclusion in 1824 at the Battle of Ayacucho in Peru. It involved dozens of separate conflicts, multiple military leaders of varying ability and character, and a complex interplay of Enlightenment ideology, local grievances, racial tensions, and competing economic interests that makes any simple narrative of liberation incomplete. The broadest context is the most important. The people of Spanish America who eventually led and won independence were not, for the most part, the indigenous or mixed-race majority of the population. They were the Criollo elite, the American-born Spaniards who owned the land, ran the businesses, staffed the lower reaches of the colonial bureaucracy, and had been progressively excluded from the highest positions of power by the Bourbon reforms. They were reading the same Enlightenment texts as the founders of the American Republic and the French revolutionaries. They had the same grievances about taxation without representation, the same aspirations for self-governance, the same conviction that their birth in America did not make them less Spanish or less capable of self-rule. The idea that the independence movements were straightforwardly democratic movements for popular liberation is an oversimplification that the leaders themselves would often not have recognized. Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín were both members of the Criollo elite. They sought independence from Spain, but their vision of what independence would mean for the indigenous peoples and the enslaved Africans who formed the majority of the population was complicated at best. Bolívar in particular had a deeply ambivalent relationship with the social implications of independence, oscillating between democratic rhetoric and authoritarian practice in ways that would eventually produce bitter conflict with his fellow independence leaders. Simón Bolívar was born in Caracas in 1783 into one of the wealthiest Criollo families in Venezuela. He was educated in Spain, travelled extensively in Europe, was present in Paris during the Napoleonic period, and witnessed Napoleon's coronation as emperor, which reportedly excited and troubled him in equal measure. He returned to Venezuela in 1810 as the independence movement was beginning, and spent the next 15 years fighting in a series of campaigns of extraordinary complexity and persistence across Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, the last of which is named after him. Bolívar was a military genius of the first order, capable of astonishing strategic insight and remarkable physical endurance. He crossed the Andes with his army in 1819, a feat that most professional soldiers would have considered impossible, and emerged to defeat the Spanish forces at the Battle of Boyacá, securing Colombian independence. He was also a visionary political thinker who dreamed of a united South American federation that could be a significant world power, a Gran Colombia that would encompass Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. This vision did not survive contact with the realities of regional identity and political ambition. In the south, José de San Martín was fighting a parallel liberation struggle. Born in Argentina but trained as a soldier in Spain, including service during the Peninsular War, San Martín returned to South America in 1812 and began organizing the liberation of the Southern Cone. His greatest achievement was the crossing of the Andes in 1817 with an army of nearly 5,000 men in the winter, which was not supposed to be possible, and the liberation of Chile in the following year. He then transported his army by sea to Peru, which was the heartland of Spanish power in South America, and captured Lima in 1821. The decisive campaign in Peru required the coordination of San Martín's and Bolívar's forces, which led to a famous meeting between the two men at Guayaquil in Ecuador in 1822. What they discussed was never fully disclosed, but San Martín withdrew from the campaign shortly afterward, leaving Bolívar to complete the liberation of Peru. The reasons for this withdrawal remain debated by historians. What is clear is that the two men had different visions for South America's future, and one of them stepped aside. The final Spanish defeat at the Battle of Ayacucho on December 9, 1824, marked the effective end of Spanish imperial power on the American mainland. Spain retained Cuba and Puerto Rico, which it would hold until 1898, but the vast continental empire that had been built over 3 centuries was gone. Mexico's independence had followed a different and more complicated path. The initial revolt launched by the priest Miguel Hidalgo with his famous Grito de Dolores, the Cry of Dolores, in September 1810 drew on popular forces, mestizos and indigenous people, in ways that alarmed the Criollo elite as much as it alarmed the Spanish authorities. Hidalgo was captured and executed in 1811. The independence movement continued under a series of leaders, most notably José María Morelos, another priest of lower social origins who combined military talent with genuine social vision, until eventually the Criollo conservatives, alarmed by the liberal revolution in Spain of 1820, switched sides and supported independence as a way of protecting their social position. Agustín de Iturbide, a royalist officer-turned-independence leader, proclaimed Mexican independence in September 1821. The loss of the Americas represented the most catastrophic territorial diminishment of any empire in modern history. In the space of 15 years, Spain lost territories comprising about a fifth of the world's landmass and populations of tens of millions. The economic consequences were severe, depriving the Spanish crown of the colonial revenues it had depended on for 3 centuries. Spain was now a medium-sized European power with a history of being much more, which is a psychological position from which it has never fully recovered. 1898. The end of everything. After the loss of the mainland Americas, Spain still held remnants of its empire: Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, the Philippines in the Pacific, a few islands here and there. These were not nothing. Cuba in particular was enormously valuable, one of the world's leading sugar producers, and by the later 19th century one of the most profitable colonial possessions in the world. Spain had held on to Cuba partly because the geography made it more defensible than the mainland, and partly because the Cuban Criollo elite was more divided on the question of independence, with a significant loyalist faction that remained through most of the early 19th century. But by the 1860s, independence movements were stirring in Cuba. The 10 Years' War from 1868 to 1878 was the first serious independence struggle, fought primarily in the eastern provinces of Cuba, and ended with the negotiated peace that promised reform Spain did not deliver. In 1895 the war resumed, sparked in part by the writings and organizing of José Martí, a poet and political thinker who had spent most of his adult life in exile in New York, and who managed to be simultaneously one of the greatest Spanish-language poets of the 19th century, and one of the most effective political organizers of any period. He was killed in one of the first skirmishes of the war in May 1895, which secured his status as a martyr and ensured that his ideas would define Cuban national identity for generations. Spain responded to the renewed Cuban revolt with the appointment of General Valeriano Weyler, who implemented a policy of reconcentration, concentrating the rural Cuban population into fortified camps to deprive the rebels of their civilian support network. The camps were, by multiple accounts, deeply inhumane. Disease and starvation killed tens of thousands of civilians concentrated in them. The American press, particularly the New York newspapers of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, covered these conditions with a mixture of genuine humanitarian concern and naked commercial sensationalism. Hearst's New York Journal and Pulitzer's New York World competed to publish the most outrageous accounts of Spanish atrocities, inflaming American public opinion in what became known as yellow journalism. The United States had been watching Cuba with strategic and economic interest for decades. American investors had significant holdings in Cuban sugar. American politicians across the spectrum had been discussing the eventual absorption of Cuba since before the Civil War. President William McKinley was under intense domestic pressure to intervene but was initially reluctant, preferring negotiation. Then, on the 15th of February 1898, the American battleship Maine, anchored in Havana Harbor, exploded, killing 266 American sailors. The cause of the explosion remains debated to this day. It was almost certainly an internal accident related to spontaneous combustion in the coal bunkers adjacent to the ammunition stores, a common hazard of the period. But in the superheated atmosphere of American press coverage of Cuba, the explosion was immediately blamed on Spain. Remember, the Maine became the rallying cry for American intervention. McKinley asked Congress for authority to intervene in Cuba in April 1898, and Congress declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War lasted 113 days and was one of the most asymmetric conflicts in modern history. The United States had been industrializing at an extraordinary pace for 3 decades and had developed a modern navy under the strategic influence of Alfred Thayer Mahan, who had argued in his highly influential book The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890 that naval power was the key to great power status. The Spanish navy was old, underfunded, and hopelessly outmatched. The Spanish army in Cuba was exhausted by 3 years of counterinsurgency warfare and decimated by tropical disease. The American Navy destroyed the Spanish Caribbean Squadron at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba on July 3, 1898, in a lopsided engagement in which all 6 Spanish warships were sunk or captured, and 474 Spanish sailors were killed. The American casualties were 1 dead and 2 wounded. In the Philippines, Commodore George Dewey had already destroyed the Spanish Pacific Fleet at Manila Bay on May 1, 1898, in an engagement of similar one-sidedness. The American fleet sailed into Manila Bay in the early morning, and by noon had destroyed or captured all 10 Spanish warships, suffering 8 sailors wounded and none killed. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, ended Spanish sovereignty over Cuba, which became a nominally independent state under strong American influence. Spain ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. Spain also ceded the Philippines to the United States for $20 million, a sale that most Filipinos had not been consulted about and that led directly to the Philippine-American War, which was considerably bloodier than the Spanish-American War and lasted 3 years. Spain also sold its remaining Pacific Island possessions, the Mariana Islands, the Caroline Islands, and Palau, to Germany for 25 million pesetas. In Spain, 1898 was experienced as a national catastrophe of the first order. The word disaster, became the term for the event itself. A generation of Spanish intellectuals, the generation of 98, responded with a sustained examination of Spanish identity, Spanish decline, and what had gone wrong. Writers like Miguel de Unamuno, Antonio Machado, Pío Baroja, and Ramiro de Maeztu confronted the question of Spain's future with sometimes brilliant, sometimes anguished urgency. Unamuno in particular asked what Spain could offer the world beyond its empire, and answered that it could offer a particular kind of tragic, passionate engagement with existence that the mechanized, industrialized, rationalistic Northern European powers lacked. His answer was not entirely satisfying, but it was deeply felt. 1898 was the moment when Spain finally confronted the full extent of its decline. The empire that had once circled the globe, that had sent its ships to every ocean and its soldiers to every continent, that had funded the greatest art and the most powerful armies of the 16th century, had been defeated in 3 months by a country that had not existed when Spain was at its height. The last flags were hauled down, the last colonies were ceded. Spain was now unambiguously a small European power with a great history. The psychological weight of that history, both its glories and its crimes, has never stopped pressing on the country. It shapes Spanish politics and Spanish culture to this day, often in ways that are not fully acknowledged. How to be the heir of an empire that was both magnificent and terrible. How to carry the weight of what was done in Spain's name to the peoples of the Americas and the Philippines and Africa. How to understand a national identity that was built on the idea of universal Christian empire, and must now exist without either empire or the certainty of universal mission. These questions did not end with 1898. They continue. The legacy, what Spain left behind. The Spanish Empire lasted, depending on how you count, from approximately 1492 to 1898. That is 406 years of expansion, governance, exploitation, and cultural creation on a global scale. What it left behind is everywhere, and it is permanent. The most obvious legacy is language. Spanish is today the world's second most widely spoken language by native speakers, with roughly 500 million people speaking it as their first language, and perhaps 150 million more using it regularly. It is the official language of 20 countries, all of them in the Americas or connected to the Spanish colonial world. It is the second most widely studied foreign language on Earth, behind only English. The Spanish language spread because Spain created the political structures within which it spread, building schools, churches, and universities that use Spanish as the medium of instruction, and because it was the language of economic and social advancement in the colonial world. This linguistic legacy is both a genuine enrichment of the world's cultural heritage and a reminder of how that enrichment was achieved. The indigenous languages of the Americas that were replaced by Spanish, or pushed to the margins of social life, number in the hundreds. Nahuatl, Quechua, Maya, Guarani, and many others survived as living languages, some with significant numbers of speakers, but their social status was fundamentally altered by colonialism. The Mexican writer Octavio Paz, in his extraordinary meditation The Labyrinth of Solitude, reflected on what it means to be a Mexican intellectual writing in Spanish, the language of the conquerors, about the experience of the conquered. It is a question without a comfortable answer. The Catholic Church planted across the Americas by Spanish missionaries endured. Latin America today has the largest Catholic population of any region in the world. The form of Catholicism that developed in the Americas is not identical to Spanish metropolitan Catholicism. It absorbed indigenous beliefs and practices in ways that produced something genuinely new. The syncretic popular Catholicism of the Day of the Dead in Mexico, the cult of the Pachamama blended with the Virgin Mary in the Andes, the Afro-Caribbean religious traditions that incorporate Catholic saints alongside African deities in Cuba and Brazil. Religion, like language, was imposed but then transformed by the people who received it, creating something that belongs to the Americas as much as it belongs to Spain. The legal and institutional legacy is less visible but equally pervasive. The Spanish brought their legal tradition, derived from Roman law, to the Americas, and that legal tradition shaped the development of legal institutions across Latin America in ways that still differentiate them from the common law traditions of the British colonial world. The notion of the state as the primary guarantor of rights and the source of legitimate authority, rather than the common law tradition of rights existing prior to the state, has its roots in this Spanish legacy. The concept of the fuero, the special legal status of particular groups, which came from the medieval Iberian experience of managing multiple communities with different legal statuses, influenced how colonial and post-colonial Latin American states managed ethnic and regional diversity. The architecture of the Spanish colonial world endures in extraordinary abundance. The cities that the Spanish built in the Americas were built to last, and many of them have lasted. Mexico City, built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, contains one of the world's great historic city centers. Lima, Cartagena, Havana, Quito, Bogotá, Buenos Aires all bear the marks of Spanish colonial planning in their cathedral squares, their grid street patterns, their Baroque churches. The UNESCO World Heritage List contains dozens of Spanish colonial cities and monuments, recognition that whatever the circumstances of their construction, these are genuine achievements of human civilization. The economic legacy is complicated. The silver of Potosi and the other great mines of the Americas funded the early modern European economy in ways that created both the commercial capitalism of the 16th and 17th centuries and the inflationary crisis that followed the overabundance of silver. The transatlantic economy created trade networks that were genuinely global for the first time in human history, connecting the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia in commercial relationships that were exploitative but also creative. The Columbian Exchange, the biological exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New, is perhaps the single most important ecological event in human history. The potatoes and tomatoes that are now central to European cuisine came from the Americas. The maize that feeds sub-Saharan Africa came from the Americas. The sugar that sweetened European civilization, produced at such terrible human cost, came from the Americas via Spain's colonial system. The horses that transformed the cultures of the North American Great Plains came from the Spanish colonial world. The human legacy is the most complex and the most painful. The descendants of the people who survived the conquest, the mestizo and indigenous populations of Latin America, carry in their DNA and their cultures the evidence of the collision between their ancestral worlds and the Spanish Empire. The descendants of the enslaved Africans who were brought to the Americas carry both the trauma of that displacement and the extraordinary cultural creativity that produced Afro-Latin music, religion, art, and thought that has enriched the world. The descendants of the Spanish colonists carry the inheritance of both achievement and atrocity. The relationships between these groups, the patterns of racial hierarchy and economic inequality that the Spanish colonial system established, have not been erased by independence or by time. Latin America today has some of the highest levels of economic inequality in the world, and that inequality correlates with race in ways that trace directly to the colonial social system. The indigenous peoples of Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, and elsewhere are on average significantly poorer than the mestizo and criollo populations. The Afro-Latino populations of Brazil and the Caribbean are on average significantly poorer than the populations of European descent. These are not accidents of history. They are the living consequences of a colonial system that was designed to extract value from certain groups for the benefit of others. Spain itself carries the weight of this history in complicated ways. For most of the 20th century, the Francoist regime that ruled Spain from 1939 to 1975 preferred a narrative of the empire as a civilizing mission, a generous gift of Christianity and culture to the peoples of the New World, rather than a story of conquest and exploitation. This narrative is still alive in certain Spanish political and cultural circles, and is still vigorously contested. The debates about whether to remove statues of Columbus, whether to celebrate the anniversary of 1492 as discovery or as invasion, whether Spain owes an apology to the peoples it colonized, are real and ongoing debates in Spain today. Felipe VI of Spain issued statements in 2021 acknowledging the difficult aspects of the colonial past, but stopped short of a formal apology, noting that history cannot be judged by the standards of the present. Latin American leaders responded variously, with some demanding a full apology, and others pointing out that the descendants of Spanish colonizers who now govern their countries share in the colonial inheritance as much as Spain does. The conversation is ongoing and genuinely difficult because it does not have a clean resolution. What the Spanish Empire ultimately represents is both the extraordinary capacity of human civilization and the extraordinary capacity of human civilization for violence and exploitation. The same culture that produced Cervantes and Velázquez and the mysticism of Teresa of Avila produced the Inquisition and Potosi and the burning of the Maya books. These are not separate things. They grew from the same soil, were watered by the same water, and are part of the same story. The Spanish Empire was the first truly global empire, the first political entity to connect every inhabited continent in a single system of governance and commerce. In that sense, it was genuinely new in human history, genuinely unprecedented in its reach and its ambition. The world that it created, the Atlantic economy, the Pacific trade routes, the Spanish-speaking Americas, the Catholic Church in its Latin American forms, the biological and cultural exchanges that the conquest set in motion, is in important ways still the world we live in. When you eat a potato in Europe, that is the Spanish Empire. When you hear a mariachi band, that is the Spanish Empire meeting the indigenous music of Mexico. When you buy something made in the Philippines, you're participating in a trade route that the Manila Galleon established. When a Spanish speaker in New Mexico uses words whose roots go back to Arabic through medieval Castilian, you are hearing the deep time of a civilization layered on top of civilization. The Spanish Empire was an act of human will imposed on the world through violence and faith and ambition and greed. It lasted 4 centuries. It changed everything. And its consequences are still unfolding in the lives of hundreds of millions of people on every continent except Antarctica, which the Spanish never got around to claiming, though they almost certainly would have if they had found silver there. That is the complete story, or as complete as any story 4 centuries long can be in a single night's telling. From the Phoenicians arriving on the Iberian coast to Ferdinand and Isabella unifying Spain. From Columbus sailing into the unknown to the conquistadors building on ruins. From the silver of Potosi to the art of the Golden Age. From the exhaustion of Philip Sus to the catastrophe of 1898. From the mission to Christianize the world to the world that Christianity made in new forms. It is a story of ambition and faith and cruelty and beauty and loss, which is to say it is a story of being human, at scale, across centuries. And now, as this long evening reaches its end, it is time to let it rest. Let the weight of all those centuries settle gently, the way silt settles in a river, drifting slowly downward through the water, finding its place at the bottom. The silver galleons are still somewhere in the deep Atlantic, their cargoes dissolving into the ocean floor over 5 centuries of salt water. The prayer said in the first cathedral in the Americas still hang in the tropical air above their stone foundations. The Maya books that were burned are gone, but the Maya languages are still spoken by millions of people who carry their own history forward into this century. History does not end. It simply becomes the past that the present stands on, and the past is always beneath us, closer than we think, as close as the potatoes in the kitchen, as close as the language in which we dream. The night is long and quiet. Let your breathing slow now. Let the centuries dissolve one by one, the way candles go out in a cathedral when the ceremony is over. The gold and the silver and the blood and the faith and the beauty and the terrible cost of everything, let it all go quiet, one breath at a time, until all that remains is the steady hum of the world, turning on its axis the way it has always turned, carrying all of us forward together through the dark. Sleep well.